The Deptford Histories, The Oaken Throne. Written by Robin Jarvis. Read by Fiona Shaw. Side 1. The medieval city of London sheltered snugly behind its walls. The pale light of the afternoon was already growing dim, and soft shadows were now stealing over the stonework. By the eastern gate, tall turrets reared up on either side. One had fallen into disrepair. The roof collapsed long ago. Upon the cracked stones of that grim high place, a small figure sat, watching the bright arc of the moon. A stifled cry blurted out as Vesper Tilio, or just plain Vesper, covered his face. "It is not fair," he wailed. "This night all will be ended." Vesper raised one foot in the air. Then with a shout he leapt from the tower. Down he plunged, plummeting through the night like a stone. Soon his body would be smashed upon the cobbles below. A scream rent the night as Vesper hurtled down, and then, even as his death rushed towards him, he yelled, "Not yet! I'll not be quenched so easily!" And with that, the bat opened his wings and skillfully skimmed over the ground. Then, beating the air, Vesper soared high over the rooftops once more, back to the ruined tower. Returning to the ledge, Vesper stood and took up a small bag. He slung it over his shoulder and, taking a last look round him, passed inside the broken tower. He could hear babbling voices charged with anticipation and excitement. It was a momentous time for his people, and they talked of nothing but the coming night. As Vesper passed darkened chambers, he caught glimpses of what was happening within. In one, 2 large matrons were busily preparing weapons for the pouch bombers to take with them. In another, a knight of the moon stood grim and fierce, great wings spread wide, as his 3 daughters carefully painted images of flame on them. Rogar was his name, a great warrior whose valour was renowned throughout the 12 colonies. Vesper hurried on, and when he finally ducked under the curtain which covered the entrance to his home, his mother, Indith, glanced up crossly. "My son, many hours have passed since you were sent to fetch more pigment." Vesper said nothing, but gazed over to one corner of their cramped quarters. There upon a shelf, cut into the stone wall, his father's armour glinted. "Poor Vesper," Indith said in a gentler voice. "I guess what troubles your heart. This must be very difficult for you." "Please, let me fly with the others. I want to see those squirrels perish for what they and their Starwife have done to us. If it were not for them, Father might still be alive." "No, you're not old enough to wear your father's armour," Indith replied firmly. "It is no merry game that General Rogar leads the might of the 12 colonies into. All have been trained and know their part exactly. Once our warriors have destroyed the Starwife and her hateful subjects, we will have our birthright once more, prophecy and insight bestowed upon us by the heavenly lady. That is our gift, my child, and by the dawn we shall possess it once more." Vesper sniffed unhappily. The greatest night in all their history, and he was too young to take part. It really wasn't fair. If only there was some way. It was a dark time, a time of magic and menace, when great forests covered the land and the world was wild and dangerous. Yet in some isolated places the light of reason and understanding continued to shine. Age after age, back to the dawn of dawns, when the first oak sprang from the soil and the hawthorn bloomed, the Starwives had ruled. According to their legends, the black squirrels were the first to awaken, born among the branches of the new trees upon the green hill which reached down to the great river. There, in the green reach, they were divided into 5 royal houses, and they took for themselves lands to govern. Yet over all, the Starwife reigned. But as the years passed, the royal houses were separated. Their lands dwindled as the forests grew dark, and their borders shrank until they were like islands struggling to repel a black tide. Yet in the land of Greenreach the flowers continued to bud, and there at least the spirit of the green still walked, blessing the groves and trees with his presence. At the summit of the holy place, a mighty oak stood. Its branches spread far and high, and within its vast trunk the Starwife dwelt, watching the darkening world and grieving for it. It was a tall black squirrel who, with furtive steps, crept along a slimy path deep beneath the hallowed oak. The lady Moena cursed the mud, but holding the candle before her, she strode confidently forward, and there, appearing out of the darkness, was a small wooden door. The chamber beyond was far wider and loftier than the passageway, but the place stank. The foul reek of stagnant water and rank mould invaded her nostrils, and the squirrel spluttered for a second, mirroring the action of the candle. From the invisible distance there came a sudden plop as a bubble erupted on the surface of the water. Moena grinned and took from a pocket in her cloak some shreds of raw meat. Now the chamber was filled with horrible gurglings. The water seethed, and bestial grunts roared towards her. Then the eyes rose from the water, and a gnarled and webbed claw thrust forward, squelching through the mud as a vast toad hauled itself from the mire. Without warning, Moena leapt forward, bringing her foot violently down upon the back of the creature's head. "Fret you not, my darling. There's naught to fear. 'Twill not take long." Her dagger flashed in the candlelight as she brought it close to the monster's putrid skin. At once a watery dark green liquid squirted from the wound, but Moena was ready and collected all that she could in a tiny phial of blue glass. From the dark pool, several new pairs of eyes gazed morosely across at her, and she gave a cruel little laugh. "Have patience, my other loves. Shortly your rancid bellies will be full of the sweetest meat you have ever tasted." And with that she left the chamber. Within the ancient tree all was quiet. Silver lamps were suspended from the carved ceiling, and they cast deep shadows over Moena's hooded eyes. A flight of stairs cut into the living timber rose before her, and she quickly blew out the candle she was carrying before ascending to her mistress's bedchamber. 2 sentries barred the way, but they stood aside as she approached, and she opened the ornate door as silently and gently as she could. Like a thief she crept into the room. "Who is it?" whispered a frail voice. "'Tis I, madam." The Starwife rolled back the blanket that she had tucked beneath her whiskered chin and wrapped it round her knees. She was an ancient squirrel whose black fur had long since turned white with age. Long untold years she had reigned, governing her subjects with wisdom and compassion. But now the Starwife was dying. The ghost of a smile tugged the crabbed corners of her mouth. "I haven't left you yet, but this fever plagues me like nothing I have known." Her withered paws closed about the silver pendant which hung around her neck, and her eyes closed as she collected her thoughts. There must be no more delays. A successor must be announced. Moena walked over to a shelf and took down a jug which contained a sweet-smelling, honey-coloured liquid. Then she took the blue phial from her cloak and let 3 dark drops fall into the bowl. "Drink of this." The Starwife received it gladly and took small sips, her trusting eyes turned upon her faithful handmaiden. Moena stood back, watching the poison slowly disappearing from the bowl. "Yes, the Ancient One continued once the vessel had been drained. "I have made my choice, Moena. I want you to summon the royal princesses. Tomorrow the heralds shall announce the accession." A choking fit prevented her saying any more. "I think not," Moena hissed. Moena unclasped the brooch at her throat and removed the cloak from her shoulders. "Long have I toiled over this," she declared, turning the garment about to display an evil black tapestry hidden within. The Starwife fell back against her pillow, racked in the most severe agony. Blood was in her mouth. Yet as she stared at her handmaiden, she forgot all pain and knew only fear. "Into the very fibres I did weave spells of smothering and silence," Moena snarled, "charms that will never yield the enchantment so great that no other power can penetrate them." "For what purpose have you done this?" Moena emitted a strange, high laugh. "Why, to cover the star-glass and to smother its might, to obliterate our defences and open our borders." And with that she strode to the door. A narrower flight of steps rose to the right, and she wasted not a moment. This was the sacred stair, and at its end, in the very crown of the hallowed oak, was the chamber of the star-glass. Slowly she crept towards the centre of the room, where the star-glass rested. Breathlessly she stood beside the great disk and gazed upon its glimmering surface. Then, with a sweep of her arm, she cast the cloak she had spent so long devising over the star-glass, and a horrible blackness filled the chamber. At once the peace of the night was disturbed. The enchantments were failing, melting and dispersing from the unguarded borders. Strange noises filled the air, and the doom of Greenreach was assured. A dark cloud had covered the moon, and the hill was steeped in shadow. A vast swarm of bats came swooping down in a gigantic phalanx, and their blood-curdling cries tore through the tormented darkness. In a great triangular formation, the pouch bombers came. "The flame of victory is with us," they shrieked as they plunged expertly between the branches of the trees. An almighty explosion rocked the green hill, and a ball of crimson flame blasted upwards. One after another the fire eggs erupted, and their dazzling flames blossomed like deadly flowers about the hallowed oak. The pouch bombers glided over the devastation. Then in one graceful movement the formation veered away up to where the others were waiting. Resplendent in their screech masks, the Knights of the Moon had seen it all. Down swooped the ferocious generals, and the captains screamed after them. Rogar, with the screech mask, Slaughtermore upon his head, fanned out his wings and hurtled over the shrieking squirrels. Everywhere the captains and their winged armies were slaying the abominable tree rats. Screech masks turned blood red as the slaughter increased, and gore rained down from the vicious talons. The squirrels were powerless to resist, already vanquished by the nightmare of the fire eggs. They were no match for this more savage onslaught. From her bedchamber, the Starwife's eyes drank in the monstrous spectacle. "So, it is over," she muttered slowly, and clasping the amulet round her neck, the ancient squirrel closed her eyes and poured out her waning strength. In the distance, London slept. The mews was warm and dark, and a slant of moonlight slid through the poorly secured shutter, but none of the birds of prey who rested upon their perches within could see it. Each wore a hood over its eyes, and their feet were tied to the perch by ribbons of leather. The peregrine cocked his head and listened. Everything seemed quiet, and he wondered what could have awoken him. Then something strange began to happen. The tethers which held the falcon's feet moved as if invisible hands had clutched them. With a tremendous shrill yell, the peregrine rejoiced. His feet were free, and he immediately tore the hood from his head. And then, by the same unseen power, the shutters of the mews were thrown open. The peregrine gave a grim screech and shot out into the night, free at last. Moena hastened from the chamber of the star-glass and swept down the narrow stairway. As she came to her mistress's bedchamber, she thrilled at what would come to pass. Moena barged inside, but at once her dreams were snatched away. There upon the sill of the window a great falcon sat, and standing before him, swaying and nearly spent, the Starwife held up the symbol of her high office, the silver acorn, and entrusted it into the bird's massive talons.
"Fly, bear it to safety. Let no other claim it."
Moena dragged the ancient squirrel out of her way and lurched at the amulet. But too late, the falcon left the window, and in seconds he was out of sight, leaving Greenreach far behind. Quickly she drew the dagger from her belt and took a step towards the ancient squirrel. "Now pay the price," she cried, and shrieking with evil laughter, put her mistress cruelly to death. Rushing back to the window, Moena shouted at the top of her voice, "Rogar, quickly! I command you!" Taking a step back, she waited a moment, and presently a ferocious screech mask appeared over the sill. "Hear me!" the squirrel cried. "The silver acorn must be retrieved at all costs. Only with it about my neck can I undo the spell laid upon your kind and restore your birthright." The bat lashed his wings and circled over the hill. Furiously he called to his captains and yelled his commands. Like a black mist, the bats rose from Greenreach, and in an enormous sweep across the smoke-filled sky, the desperate chase began. Descending the narrow steps, Moena rubbed her paws together, and her tail flicked with agitation. If Rogar thought she would place all her trust in him, then he was a greater fool than she had anticipated. Her alliance with the legions of Hrethel was only temporary, and with a wicked grin glowering over her face, Moena determined to send her own, more sinister messenger to retrieve the silver acorn. Far away, amid the trackless and dangerous forests, a bright dawn gently edged into the pale, clear sky. Here, then, the second noble house of black squirrels had long ago made their home. Coldregalis, the hazel realm, it was called, for the hazel was regarded as the fount of all knowledge, and the one who ruled that land wore a bronze fruit of that tree about her neck. Ninia was her name, and her subjects loved her, for she was wise beyond mortal minds, and by her counsel and guidance the colony had protected its borders for many years. Today, however, all thoughts of the dark were banished. It was Alder Day, a date high in the squirrel calendar, and wonderful festivities had been planned. The warm rays of the morning sun gilded the avenue of trees which led to the circle of 9 hazels. Upon the green lawns an excited and merry crowd had begun to gather. Already those entertainers who still dared to travel were arriving. High above from the branches of the central oak, a young squirrel maiden looked down, intoxicated with the glamour and delight of it all. It was Ysabelle, daughter of the Lady Ninia and the Lord Silenus, and never had the forest been graced by such beauty as she possessed.
"Milady,"
squeaked a nervous voice.
"Milady, come away from there. Oh, it's so dangerous."
A mouse had peered out from a curtained window in the trunk of the tree, and her small paws were thrown over her face. Griselda had looked after Ysabelle since the day she was born, and fussed a great deal over her charge. Ysabelle capered over the branches and climbed in at the window. "It's such a marvellous day. To think that this year I join the older maids." Quickly Ysabelle twined her long hair in nimble fingers until 2 braids hung down her back. Then, with a little help from Griselda, she coiled these upon her head and sprinkled some water over her face. The mouse scrutinized her critically, smoothing and patting with her small pink paws before she would let Ysabelle go.
There, you're presentable now, my lady. Get you on down.
From the central oak a procession of squirrels came, and those in the clearing parted to let them through. Out marched the councillors, the 4 advisers to the sovereign, led by the eldest and most learned of their number, Godfrey Gelenos. Nothing gave him greater pleasure than to spend long hours with his nose pressed against the pages of some scholarly document, and it was rumoured that even the Lady Ninia had bowed to his judgment on more than one occasion. Then the noise subsided to an expectant babble as many guards paraded from the entrance, their swords brandished in the air, heralding the arrival of their monarch. So came the Lady Ninia with the Lord Silenus at her side. At once the fiddlers struck up the older tune, and the pipers followed their lead. This was the cue for the maidens to step up to the thrones and receive their wands. When this was done, they all curtsied, then proceeded to dance in a line towards the avenue of trees. The first tree that the maidens reached was the birch, and with laughter in their voices they raised their wands and shouted to the indwelling spirit. "Awake, awake," they sang, "thy sleep is ended." Everybody came to watch this age-old ritual. Even the tradesfolk left their stalls, and it was the entertainer's turn to be enthralled. The dancers visited each tree in the avenue before a great clamour of cheering and applause burst out. Breathlessly, Isabelle ran to her parents, and they both held their arms out to her. "My dearest," the Lady Ninia cried, "how proud you have made me this morning." Isabelle held on to her tightly before giving her father a hug. The Lord Silenus stroked his daughter's hair and kissed her forehead lovingly. He was a quiet, thoughtful squirrel, head of a house of princes, and he adored his child more than anything in the land. So into the joyful crowds Ysabelle now disappeared, for there was so much to see and to do. Nearby, a troop of voles had completed their daredevil pyramid twice already, and now they were encouraging some of the onlookers to take part in the act.
"Are there any amongst you, kind and goodly people, who dares to attempt the simplest of our heroic feats?"
Before Ysabelle could raise her paw, someone grabbed her arm and tutted crossly in her ear.
"What are you thinking of, my lady?" squeaked Griselda at her side. "Think of your position."
"But it's only in fun," Ysabelle argued. "Surely there's no harm in merriment." Through the milling throng the mouse led her mistress, squirming between the gathered folk until they came to where many creatures were laughing. In the midst of them, a stout jester had set up his pitch. Sitting upon his outlandish cart, he had been performing a comical play with the aid of humorous and insulting puppets. A cruel caricature of a black squirrel was in his right paw, whilst in his left a red squirrel jiggled and twitched. "Why, 'tis Master Godfrey," the crowd giggled. The jester strode about the cleared space, bashing the noses of those who sniggered, whilst all the time the daylight grew dim as a storm cloud moved swiftly through the sky. "Verily 'tis I, Godfrey Gelenos, prime counsellor of the Lady Ninia." Someone blew a raspberry, and the stoat set about him at once, to the great amusement of everyone else. Everyone except Griselda, that is.
"Scandalous vulgarity of the lowest sort. Come, my lady, I was wrong to bring you hither. The fellow's nothing but rude."
With her head in the air and her tail erect, the mouse-maid stomped from the scene. Isabelle looked back at the jester, and to her surprise found that his eyes were upon her. "I crave your pardon," he said humbly. "Methinks I outraged your companion. I assure you no harm was meant." "I'll be glad to tell her that," Isabelle replied. "What is your name?" "Wendell Maculatum. A travelling dunce fellow am I, and an accomplished fool." The jester then did a spectacular backward somersault, landing on his knees with his arms outstretched. "So I beg thee again, mistress, tell thy companion that Wendell is awash with regret for the indignity he did cause her. Suddenly a shrill blast echoed over the lawns. All festivities ceased, and everyone held their breath. Only the direst emergency would cause the border guards to give such an alarm. The face of every creature slowly turned heavenwards, and there, in the middle of the bright, clear sky, a vast black storm cloud blotted out the morning sun, and everywhere was plunged into an icy gloom. "Beware!" Lady Ninnia cried. "Run for cover! That is no cloud. It is a host of bats. See, the winged beasts are already engaged in battle." "Never have so many knights of the moon crossed our borders," the Lord Silenus muttered under his breath. "Yet why do they not attack us?" Sure enough, it seemed that the bats were mobbing some other creature of the air. At that moment, the boundary wardens came racing from the borders. Into the clearing they ran, with longbows in their grasp. "Green guide our arrows!" With a sharp hiss, 50 darts went singing through the sky, plunging deep into the bat swarm. Isabelle watched as a dozen moonriders tumbled from the darkness and were dashed against the trees below. Another torrent of arrows whistled upwards, yet, even as the shafts shot into the vast cloud, something glinted and fell through the air like a glittering stone. Before she knew what she was doing, Isabelle had caught it in her paws. Trembling, she opened her fist and gazed at the wondrous thing in her palm. There, gleaming in the sunlight, was a silver acorn. Then, shrieking, she leapt away, just as a great shredded mass of feathers came crashing to the ground. In ghastly tatters the body of the peregrine lay still upon the blood-dewed grass. "Get down!" a voice shouted to Ysabelle. Isabelle heard something clattering towards her, but she dared not look up. Wendell Maculatum, travelling stoat and General Ninny, pelted towards the maiden. With the handles of his cart in his paws, he sped to save her. Hurling his cart forward, its 2 rickety wheels skidded to a halt either side of Ysabelle, and the stoat dived under it too. Roaring like a thunderstorm, the legions of moonriders hurled themselves against the cart until it was totally obliterated. It was this that held their full attention. So desperate were they to retrieve the amulet. Then the guards of Col Regalis drew their swords and with grim faces charged at the frightful enemy. General Rogar squinted about him. The talons of his gauntlets gouged deep into the cart, and he snarled within slaughter-maw. "Come," he bellowed, "let us withdraw to the darkness of the forest. The day-star confounds our senses." He soared into the blue sky, and like a plume of black smoke, the rest of his army reared up and followed. "Ysabelle!" the Lady Ninnia shouted. Running forward, she pushed through the sea of the wounded and dead to where the jester's cart stood splintered and broken. "Mother!" A meek voice spoke from beneath the wreckage. Ninnia's heart leapt, and she heaved at the cart to lift it. A strong paw touched her own as Silenus joined her, and together they hurled the battered shelter aside. There, trembling and huddled against the stoat, was Ysabelle. "Good sir," Ninnia began, "you have saved our beloved daughter. For such a gallant deed no reward would be enough. Yet name what you will, and it shall be thine." "Gracious lady and noble lord," Wendell said with a chuckle in his voice, "what would a fool do with such a reward? Nay, leave the jester be. Let him continue his merry craft, and spoil him not." Ysabelle held up her paw, and there, shining in her fingers, was the silver acorn. Ninnia touched the bronze hazelnut about her neck, and the world grew chill once more. "What does this mean?" her husband asked in a whisper. "What omen of disaster is this?" The Lady Ninnia closed her eyes, and when she answered, her voice was filled with grief. "Greenreach has fallen." Master Godfrey hurried along the corridor to the council chamber and tucked the scrolls he had been studying under his arm. "Master Godfrey," the Lady Ninnia called, Come, we did delay the meeting for your arrival." The squirrel cleared his throat and strutted pompously to his place beside the thrones. "Did you discover what you sought?" Godfrey patted the scrolls he carried and said that he had. "Then we must make haste and begin." Lady Ninnia signalled to the sentries who were standing at the back, and they hurried from the room, only to return a minute later, dragging something behind them. The crowd caught their breath. Some of the black squirrels growled fiercely, others leapt to their feet and drew what weapons they had. "Peace," the lady commanded. "Bring him forward." Bound in chains and surrounded by guards, the prisoner was dragged. He was a knight of the moon, one of Rogar's many captains. A livid wound scarred the bat's chest, and a great rip had rendered his wings useless. Yet his sharp eyes, which roved about the room, were filled with arrogance and hatred. "What is thy name?" The bat glowered at the squirrel queen and ached to kill her. "Ysabelle," the lady said gently, "show to our guest that which you found this morning." Slowly, Ysabelle rose from her chair, her eyes staring at the repulsive bat. Then she raised her paw for all to see and uncurled her fingers. The silver acorn gleamed in her palm, and everyone held their breath. At once the prisoner squirmed and struggled, straining at his bonds to free himself, but the chains were strong, and the guards were not about to release him. "Tell me," Ninnia commanded, "what terrible fate has befallen the land of Greenreach?" A mocking sneer crept over the bat's face. "Why not tell them? Let them know the awesome might of Rethel's forces." "Heglir is my name, and may my words give thee no comfort. Greenreach has indeed fallen. Our legions destroyed the stinking lair of the Starwife this past night, and she too has been deservedly put to death." "Impossible. The power of the Starwife is unassailable." Heglir threw back his head and guffawed. "Is that so? Then know this, a traitor have we nurtured in the bosom of that squalid land." "Tell me the name of this traitor." The bat merely sniggered. "I would fain cut out mine own tongue first, but this I shall willingly tell thee. None here is safe, for when the sun sets behind the world's rim, our forces shall return. Surrender while you can. Give up the pagan bauble. Let me take it to my kin." At this, Ninnia strode from her throne. "The amulet belongs to no moonrider. Only a Starwife may possess the silver." "But the Starwife is dead," cried one of the red squirrels. "Then a new one must be found." "But all the Greenreach maidens have perished." "There is but one course we can take," Ninnia declared, blinking away the tears which had sprung to her eyes. "It is our duty now to restore a Starwife to Greenreach." Leaning forward, Master Godfrey addressed his sovereign. "But, madam, just who is to take up the silver?" Ninnia glanced at her husband, and the guilt in her eyes betrayed her thoughts to him. "No," he breathed, "you cannot." But the lady raised her paw. "The new Starwife, the next handmaiden of Orion, shall be the one who caught the silver acorn. My own daughter." Silenus sprang to his feet. "My lady, would you send our beautiful daughter from this realm and into certain death?" "It would be death for her to remain." "Then let her die with us." "If she journeys to Greenreach, she may not perish. That way there is hope." The Lord Silenus gazed at her sadly. "Do you really think there is a chance?" "Only the faintest glimmer. But we can delay no longer. Before the afternoon comes, Ysabelle must already be on her way." At her side, Master Godfrey pressed his fingertips together. "We must send many guards and sentries with your daughter to protect her." "My thanks, Master Godfrey. I do know that." "Then how many shall accompany her?" All of them. The room was filled with horrified murmurs. That would leave our land defenceless. Surely we should retain some of our archers at the very least. They would be useless against the strength of our enemy. All hope now lies with my daughter. It is she who must be protected.
Be sure of that, Higlear hooted gleefully. What folly you speak, and how easily you will fall victim to my brothers.
The lady stared at the prisoner. A pity you shall not be here to witness it, for you shall also journey to Greenreach.
For what purpose?
Along the way, I have no doubt my guards will be able to extract much useful intelligence from you.
Thou shalt learn nothing from me.
Without warning, Higlear's head whirled to the side, and his fangs snapped at the guard holding his chains. The squirrel leapt back, and in a trice the prisoner was free. Whirling round, he struck the other guards with his damaged wing, and with a mad laugh bellowing in his throat, he rushed at one of the sentries. Before the squirrel could move, the bat had thrown himself upon his spear, and with a hideous gurgle, the laughter ended. "Good," said Isabelle coldly. "I'm glad it's dead. It was ugly and vile, and I hate all their kind." The Lady Ninnia said nothing. It was not like her daughter to be so cruel, and for the first time in her life she wondered if her wisdom had failed her. The day that had begun so merrily, and which had held so much promise, was now transformed into a desperate time of grievous dread. Standing at the forefront of the lamenting crowd, Ninnia and Silenus waited for their daughter to approach. "Belle," the Lord cried, "my precious darling." Ninnia stood apart. A bleakness overwhelmed her. She wanted to reach out and never let go of Ysabelle, but the mask must stay in place a little while longer. "Oh, Father," Ysabelle sobbed, "I don't want to leave. Please do not make me." Silenus glanced at his wife, but her face was like stone. Taking Ysabelle lightly by the paw, Ninnia led her to where a group of 8 guards saluted and came to attention. A large gilded couch stood at their side. "This will bear you to Greenreach. Griselda shall accompany you, and Master Godfrey will be your guide. The day grows old. You must leave now."
"Oh, milady," Griselda cooed, "look at the Prime Counsellor. See who's walking with him. Well, I never did."
Down the avenue of trees, the eldest of the Queen's advisers came, and at his side walked Wendell the jester. The two seemed to be involved in a most heated discussion, punctuated by vehement shakes of the head from Master Godfrey and feverish hops from the stoat. When he reached the Lady Ninnia, the counsellor bowed low and announced that all was ready. The route had been planned. The lady nodded, then looked to where Wendell sat on the grass, his face miserable and forlorn. "Tell me, Master Godfrey, what were you and that stoat talking about?" "Would you believe it, madam? That nauseating and vulgar personage was asking to join this noble company." "Well, tell the jester he may join you." Godfrey gasped and mumbled under his breath, but his sovereign had decided. The heralds blew their trumpets, but the sound echoed hollowly about the avenue like a funeral dirge. As the sombre procession moved away, the Lady Ninnia moved to her husband's side. "Green be with you, my little Belle," Silenus whispered. Ninnia stared intently at the blank stretch of trees into which the host of Col Regalis had marched. "What have I done? Our child is gone. She is lost to us." Silenus trembled as all the pain his wife had concealed erupted in great racking bursts of emotion. "There is no time to mourn. If we are to be ready for the assault which will befall us this coming night, then there is much to do." With that, he strode to the centre of the avenue and began rallying his subjects. Alone, her soul destroyed and her heart bereft and empty, the Lady Ninnia touched her bronze amulet and closed her eyes. "I was wrong. Our daughter is not ready. To become the handmaiden of Orion, one must know terrible grief in order to learn compassion. May she find what she needs upon that dark and deadly road which I have sent her. My poor, poor child. Farewell." The woods that flanked the hazel realm were calm and tranquil glades. But now the watch-drays were empty. Every squirrel had joined the company of Ysabelle, and an uneasy silence possessed the once tame woodland. So no eyes saw the great army of Col Regalis march deeper towards the shadowy forest. At the vanguard of the company, Master Godfrey finished instructing the royal marshals on the route he had devised and stood to one side. As the countless wardens, sentries and guards marched by, he rolled up the maps he had been studying and went in search of the princess's litter. "We make good time, my lady." Isabelle nodded as Godfrey trotted alongside, but did not know what to say. The Prime Councillor cleared his throat. "The straight path to the Holy Land lies, of course, due north, but we cannot go that way. Once the forces of Rethel discover our flight, they shall naturally assume that to be our route. This is why I have chosen a large detour to the west." He held out the map for Isabelle's inspection and approval, but the squirrel maiden barely glanced at it. "Forgive me, Master Godfrey, but mine head is too full of grief to think of aught else. Later, perhaps." The sunlight grew dim as the ceiling of branch and twig became tangled and knotted overhead. Here was the beginning of the wild world, and a sensation of dread and apprehension coursed throughout the entire company as they left the safe woods far behind.
"Oh, I don't like this, milady,"
Griselda miserably whimpered. Isabelle leaned out of the litter and looked to where Godfrey was telling the marshals to unsheath their swords and begin cutting through any obstacles in their path. "Fear not, for the undergrowth which slows us down will also screen us from the eyes of Rethel's army." But Griselda was not so easily comforted.
"Well, if they don't get us, the hoppers will," she yelped. "You remember the stories I used to tell you, milady?"
Her mistress threw the mouse a reproachful look that was mostly born from fear. "Keep the ogres of the nursery under your cap, Griselda. I don't want to hear of them again." "Oh, mistress," came a voice above the clattering of the cart's wheels. "What can be the delay?" Isabelle's face broke into a full grin as the jester came hurrying alongside, pushing his repaired wagon before him. A loud tut issued from the litter as Griselda showed her disapproval of the stoat's familiarity. The jester ran his fingers over the mouse's lips, and suddenly the litter was filled with the flutter of many wings as countless painted moths seemed to escape from her mouth.
"Eek!"
she wailed as the insects issued forth and tickled her face.
"Oh, you wretch!"
Isabelle battered the moths away with her paw and giggled as they flew from the canopy. "Dear jester, if you've any more tricks, you'd best leave them in your cart. I fear my maid does not approve."
"Why, I have never seen such disgraceful behaviour," spluttered Griselda. "Keep away, you knave, before I tell the guards to see you off and leave you to the mercy of the hoppers."
For an instant the stoat's face lost all trace of humour, as though the mere mention of the dreaded cult had terrified him. At the forefront of the company, Samuel Moena hewed at the stubborn thicket of holly. He had been in the service of the boundary wardens for nearly 5 years, and behind him he had left a wife and 3 young children. He hated this place. It was nothing like the well-ordered woods of his home. Suddenly his sword ceased hissing through the air. "There's something over there, I'm sure of it." That was enough for the others. With a shout, 20 of them ran forward, brandishing swords and spears. From within the thorn bush there came a terrified howl, and a small figure tried to scurry through a narrow opening in the brambles. "A bat! Take him! Take him!" Vesper Tilio squirmed between the sharp thorns as fast as he could, but it was no good. The young bat's left wing was damaged, and he was unable to fly. He shrieked as the tree rats launched themselves at him, and their strong paws seized him roughly. "Maggot fodder!" screamed Samuel Moena to Vesper's face. "You'll pay for what you've done." He hurled the bat down and swiftly drew his sword. "Hold!" cried a stern voice. Godfrey Galenus pushed through the ranks of the other sentries that had gathered behind Samuel until he stood beside him and glared at the warden threateningly. "The worm is mine," Samuel growled. "Look again. What terrible warrior is it you have caught? What mighty general have you captured, Warden Muir?" Samuel glanced back at the terrified Vesper, and his stomach heaved within him. "'Tis naught but a child. Why, my own son Burgle can be no older." Godfrey turned to the others. They too were sickened. "Bring him to where Lady Ysabelle waits. He must be questioned." Godfrey led the bat to where a stoat in a strange headdress gawped at him stupidly, and beads of perspiration prickled over Vesper's brow. This was it. The old black squirrel drew the green material aside, and the young bat saw. Vesper nearly choked. Seated upon a golden couch was a squirrel maiden and a ridiculous-looking mouse. It was so unexpected and peculiar that he almost laughed at them both. Isabelle stared at the bat and shuddered. "Are there more ahead?" "I think not, madam," said Godfrey. "The fellow must have been separated from the main host." "Take it away. Give it to the guards. Let them kill it." Godfrey whispered in Ysabelle's ear. "Remember the use your mother thought to make of Heglier." Ysabelle listened to his advice, her eyes brimming with loathing for the prisoner. "Very well. I shall question him later." So Vesper was bound with ropes and made to march with the company. For the few hours of daylight that remained, the company plunged deeper into the forest. Dusk was near, and every step brought them closer to nightfall. All talk ceased as they waited and strained to hear what they knew they must. Far away, a dull explosion boomed into the night, and a red glare shone in the heavens. The battle had begun. "It is the end," Isabelle whispered. "Col Regalis is falling. The fire eggs have come to them." Suddenly she screamed, and a violent shuddering seized her. "Mother! Father!"
"Milady!"
howled Griselda.
"They're gone. They're dead. I know it. I sense their pain."
She knew now why her mother had forced her upon this road, and she was determined that the sacrifice of the Hazel realm would not be in vain. "We cannot remain here. Greenreach is still many leagues distant. We must press on." For another hour the army marched, until Ysabelle decreed that the time had come to rest. Beneath the shelter of a dense row of holly trees, where the dead leaves were dry upon the ground, the squirrels made their camp. Blankets were cast on the soft, musty heaps, and a circular tent was erected for the new queen and her maid. She sighed and rubbed her eyes wearily. "Strange. Even after all that has occurred, I feel I could sleep. Where are the guards you sent to fetch the prisoner? Let us be done with him quickly, for I don't know how long mine eyes will stay open." Even as she finished speaking, 2 black squirrels emerged from the shadows ahead, and between them hopped Vesper, his legs still tied together. "Tell me," Isabelle began, "how many legions of your kind now guard the blessed hill of Greenreach?" The bat pursed his lips resolutely and made no reply. "Very well, then reveal unto me the name of the traitor who helped you massacre our kindred." "I shall not betray my brethren unto thee." Isabelle lost control, and she slapped the bat across his furry face. "Remove it from my sight!" The guards led Vesper away, and Isabelle turned desperately to Godfrey. "How can we ever hope for victory over such a race?" "Your mother thought there was a chance." But Isabelle had had enough that night and disappeared inside the tent.
"My poor lady,"
Griselda cooed, stroking the squirrel's raven hair.
"May your dreams be untroubled."
Presently they were both drifting into dark oblivion. Outside the tent the night was black and impenetrable. Not a hint of danger could be seen, yet every sentry gripped his spear and clutched his long bow in readiness for he knew not what. A terrible tension thrilled the air, charging the atmosphere with its tremendous power, and all found themselves breathing hard, their hearts pounding. "What is it out there?" one of the squirrels hissed to another. But his friend made no answer, and when Ulrich stared into the darkness where he had been standing, it was empty. Quickly the sentry hurried across, and there, lying upon the ground, with one arrow in his chest and another in his throat, was Ernest. Ulrich gave a fearful shout and called to the others. Then an arrow hit him in the back, and he fell across his dead friend's body. Suddenly, and without warning, the blackness beyond the encampment began to seethe and boil as a horde of dark shapes slithered from the shadows and leaped amongst the startled squirrels. "Awake!" one of the sentries shrieked. Then a dagger silenced him forever. "Godfrey!" Ysabelle called as she hurried from the tent. "Are you there, Godfrey?" Only the sounds of battle answered, and the maiden looked desperately about her.
"Aye!" screeched Griselda. "Milady, save me!"
The mouse covered her face as from the darkness a tall, hooded figure came lurching, but Ysabelle was ready. Swiftly she had strung an arrow to a dead guard's bow, and calling on her strength, she pulled the bowstring back. The arrow flew into the massive brute's leg, and it howled with rage and pain. Hurriedly she fumbled for a second arrow, but even as she took up the feathered shaft, the beast towered over her. Raising its immense claws, it brought an iron fist swinging down, and the longbow was knocked from Ysabelle's grasp. She stumbled backwards as the figure gave a blood-freezing shout and threw back its head. At once the hood fell around the creature's shoulders, and the squirrel screamed. Standing over her was an immense and repulsive rat. The last thing Ysabelle remembered was the terrified screams of Griselda, and then the night closed over her, and she was lost. All was blackness. Yet in the empty void a small thought floated through the dark sea, carried along without consciousness and unaware of the voice which desperately called its name. "Lady Isabelle, my lady, you must awaken." Ysabelle groaned as her temples pounded and her cheek stung. "Thank the green." Who is that?" she asked timidly. "'Tis I. 'Tis Godfrey. Oh, my lady, we have been so anxious for you." Ysabelle tried to move towards him, but found that she could not. Then she looked round her and beheld for the first time where they were. It was an underground chamber, a dank, loathsome dungeon, a crudely dug burrow where not even a rat would live. Ysabelle tugged fiercely at her fetters, but the metal bands bit into the raw flesh which they had exposed at her wrists. "Be still," Master Godfrey told her. "We have all struggled, but the restraints are strong and do not yield." "What happened?" Ysabelle spluttered. "Why are we here?" "I'm very much afraid that the rumours we have been hearing for these few years past are true. The cult of Hob has indeed grown again." "Then it was they who attacked us?" "Most assuredly." Many years ago, the three gods of the rats were worshipped in the depths of the dark forests. This hellish triad was called the Wraith-She, and they revelled in death and bloodshed. According to the legends, the greatest of the three was the Lord Hob, a hideous demon in rat shape. Vesper dragged the chains which had been fastened about his ankles and moved forward as far as they allowed. "Now taste the bitterness of captivity thyself, O royal one." Ysabelle shook her head, and it was then that she noticed. "The acorn, Godfrey! The amulet is missing!" Her adviser sobbed woefully. "Alas, I know. When they brought you in, it was gone from about your neck." Great tears ran down Ysabelle's face. Everything that had happened had been for that silver acorn, and she had lost it. From the shadows, Vesper laughed softly. The pathetic candle had burned very low by the time footsteps were heard outside the stout wooden door. Isabelle turned her head and listened, for out there a horrible voice was giggling and tittering to itself.
"Oh, not long. Then it'll be time. Oh, yes. Oh, yes."
A key turned in the lock, and the heavy door was pushed open, and a large hedgehog came pattering inside.
"Now, don't you fret none. Pigwiggen will take very good care of you. Oh, what a divine selection. So many fancies and toothsome beauties to relish and savour."
With that he waltzed back to the door, and with a final squeal of giddy delight locked it behind him. Isabelle turned a frightened face to Godfrey. "What do you think that meant?" Vesper snorted. "We're going to be peeled, my fine lady. Old Pigwiggen's going to make a bloody bones of us all." For what seemed an age, Ysabelle, Vesper, and the others remained in the dismal chamber. Then the sounds of footsteps once more echoed along the passage behind the door, but this time there were many feet tramping towards them. "Unchain 'em," came a gruff and growling voice. Isabelle blinked and stared at the entrance. Framed in the doorway was Pigwiggen, but behind him was a large group of ferocious-looking rats. One by one the prisoners were led out, gripped and prodded by many sharp fingers. Soon they were on the brink of a large basin-shaped dell that was ringed with trees whose misshapen roots had broken from the earth and wound about the edge like gnarled and twisted snakes. Down in the centre of this great hollow a group of free-standing stones reared from the short grass. About the stones many thousand worshippers of Hob yammered and shouted. A large claw grasped Isabelle's shoulder and dragged her over to one of the twisting roots. Quickly she was tied to it, with her paws stretched behind her back. Below her 1,000 wicked faces stared up, and she knew they were devouring her in their dark and malignant minds. Vile and raucous songs now resounded from the dell as lanterns were lit. They were made of baked clay, having a short handle below a bulbous depiction of a rat's head, and fueled by pitch from a barrel on the rim of the dell. Now all the hobbers' lanterns were ablaze, and the countless round eyes shone horribly.
"Hob," the creatures chanted. "Hob, Hob, Hob."
The rats whirled round, the rooks circled over the stones, calling the deadly name in cracked and ugly voices. The chanting continued, the dancing became faster, and the cries grew louder. Then, with one last bloodthirsty shriek to their god, the creatures fell to their knees, facing the standing stones. Upon the tallest stone itself, a terrifying apparition stood, with its arms outstretched. The high priest of Hob, dressed in a revolting raw head and bloody bones costume, in which guise the leader of the Wraithshe was rumoured to appear to his followers. A frightened gasp issued from Godfrey's throat, for there, hanging about the neck of the ghastly fiend, and gleaming in the harsh light of the lantern, was the silver acorn. Isabelle saw it too, and she shook her head in disbelief. The amulet! He must have stolen it from me.
"Children of the Wraithshe,"
the high priest declared, throwing his head back.
"Welcome."
The crowd roared fanatically and stretched their claws toward their leader in complete devotion.
"Now let the Lord Hob be worshipped,"
he demanded, and countless lanterns bobbed in the air.
"Here we go," gurgled Pigwiggen. "This is the moment."
He motioned to the rats who stood nearby, and 2 of them came forward to untie the selected squirrel.
"No!"
bawled Gwydion, as the ropes were cut from his paws.
"For pity's sake!"
Isabelle cried out and quickly looked away as the young squirrel was pinned down upon the flattest stone, and the peeling knife was raised. "Heathen scum!" cried Samuel Mewen. Warden Falago clenched his teeth and kept his eyes tight shut, and the other 3 squirrels yelled in anguish as the evil work was done and the screams of their comrade were finally stilled.
"Bring another victim,"
the high priest called, and Pigwiggen hurriedly untied another. When 2 rats came to take him, Falago did not cry, but gazed back at Ysabelle.
"For the hazel realm,"
he said simply, before they hauled him to his doom. Wincing at this horror, Godfrey Galenus desperately sought for ways to escape. Then he saw how enviously Pigwiggen watched the carnage and feasting. "Oh, dearie me," Godfrey shouted above the horrendous cheers. "Not many of us left, are there? Only 6. Soon it will be only 1, and when that one has gone, what shall you do then, Pigwiggen?" The hedgehog bit his claws in dismay.
"Not one juicy drop for me."
"Of course," Godfrey persisted. "There is a way to cheat them."
"Cheat?"
"Only of what you deserve."
The hedgehog scratched himself, then pattered closer to the tutor. "How could I do such a thing?"
"You could always slip away with one of us and go to some dark retreat to have a quiet munch of your own. See how tender is my mistress's flesh."
Pigwiggen squealed in rapture. "Yes, yes, I shall take her."
Godfrey shook his head. "Not yet. Untie me first. I shall persuade her to follow you to your table." The hedgehog cackled wickedly as he untied Godfrey's paws.
"A fine feast I shall have, and nothing will I spare for the others."
But that was the last they heard him utter, for Godfrey's fists punched the stupid hedgehog with all their might, and he stumbled backwards, rolling into a bristling ball. "Well done, Master Godfrey," Ysabelle cried. The tutor rubbed his knuckles and hastily set the others free. Godfrey led them to the pitch barrel, and with their help he heaved the vessel onto its side. Oily black goo went splashing and rushing down the slope, and when it reached the bottom, it spread over the ground.
"Hey!"
shouted Vesper.
"What about me?"
But the squirrels did not have time to release a wretched bat, for they might be spotted at any moment. "Let us run," Isabelle urged them. "We must escape this nightmare." But Godfrey shook his head. "Not yet. The silver acorn must be retrieved at all costs." The 3rd sacrifice had already been devoured by the terrible followers of Hob, and some were now wiping their mouths and turning to where the remaining prisoners were held.
"Hi!" they screamed. "They are gone! Only 1 is left! Find them!"
Everyone glared at the dark area behind the standing stones, where 4 shapes crept through the gloom.
"Kill them!"
Thousands of hoppers surged forward through the tarry mire, streaming past the altar like a foul and deadly tide. That was the moment the councillor chose to dart forward and snatch a hob lantern from a startled vole. "Kill them!" commanded the high priest. Godfrey dragged Ysabelle behind him and threw the lantern into the midst of the murderous children of Hob. With a rush, the pitch-covered ground burst into flame, and the worshippers screamed in panic as sheets of fire rippled outwards. The hobbers howled in dismay and ran wildly from the crackling blaze, for the dell had become a frightful cauldron of swirling flame. Upon the stone, the high priest shrieked with fury. A sea of flame raged about the altar, and in his boiling anger he threw down his own lantern, which exploded amid the fires. "Now, my lady," Godfrey cried, pulling Ysabelle after him. Together they braved the scorching flames and quickly scrabbled onto the stones. A surprised cry issued from the high priest as Godfrey tore at him, and the 2 figures wrangled frantically. Then, with startled yells, they tumbled through the air, somersaulting down to the ground. Ysabelle gaped at them in despair, for neither moved. She rushed forward and knelt beside the councillor. The high priest's knife was buried in his chest. Around them the fire still raged, but neither was aware of the fierce baking heat. "Do not worry," she sobbed, cradling her old tutor's head in her paws. "You will recover. You will get well, Master Godfrey. You must." A great sigh wheezed from Godfrey's lips, and he feebly shook his head. "No," he said. "My time is done." He raised a shaking paw and clasped his fingers about the neck of the high priest. "Take it," he gasped, pulling the acorn free and passing it to the maiden. "Bear the silver onto Greenreach." Suddenly a savage claw flashed out and seized the maiden's wrist. Ysabelle screamed. Behind the mask, the high priest's eyes glared up at her. "Give it back," he demanded. "The amulet is mine." The maiden leapt away, and the claw lost its grip. Clasping the silver acorn to her breast, Ysabelle spun round and ran as fast as she could. Still tied to the tree root, Vesper wriggled and squirmed, but the ropes were firmly tied. In silence, the young bat witnessed the final struggle between Godfrey and the high priest, and through the billowing curtains of smoke and flame he had seen the old squirrel die. Now Ysabelle clambered over the edge of the burning basin, and Vesper cried in amazement as she hurried over and hastily untied his bonds. "You're coming with me. Hurry." Vesper turned on her angrily. This tree-rat wasn't going to order him around any more. Then his eyes saw that the altar stone where the high priest had stood was now empty. "Come on," the bat shouted. "Run!" Ysabelle hurtled after him, and the pair of them raced beneath the yew trees and vanished into the darkness of the wild midnight forest beyond. Ysabelle had never run so desperately in all her life, but suddenly she raced headlong into a thick cobweb that spanned 2 trees. The sticky nets clung to her face in a suffocating mist, and spluttering in disgust, she wildly tore it away. Then, spitting the last strands of spider's web from her mouth, she hastened after the bat. "How dare you not wait? How dare you run away?" Vesper had been standing on the edge of a ditch where the ground fell sharply away. Emitting a cry of surprise, the squirrel maiden slipped and slithered down the sheer bank. With a squelch and a splash, she landed in the soft mud below and rolled into a trickling stream. For a second, Ysabelle sat in a most undignified position amid the swirling, freezing water, drenched and dazed. Then, thrown off balance, when she barged past, Vesper came crashing beside her. The bat fell head first into the ditch, and when he raised his head, his face was covered in sticky black mud. "You stupid, brainless, idiotic, clumsy blunderer! Did you not see why I had halted?" "I can see this is going to be extremely difficult for me," Ysabelle managed to utter. "It would be better if we said nothing more to one another until the journey is completed. There would be no benefit to either. Much wiser to assume a distinct and agreeable silence." "What are you chattering on about now?" "Greenreach. I still have to get there. Why else do you think I saved you?" Suddenly, high above them, they both heard soft, sinister laughter. Standing upon the edge of the ditch, the tall figure of the high priest was glaring down at them. "So, finally the 2 lost lambs are found." In his claw he held the knife which had killed Master Godfrey, and now he lifted it high above his head so that the dull night shone over the steel. Down the evil creature dived, his infernal gloating filling the ditch with fear and despair. But even as his malevolent form rushed to kill Vesper and Ysabelle, something strange occurred. The trickle of water that wound between the muddy shores abruptly began to glow. Veins of emerald light streaked through the stream, welling up until the entire forest seemed to blaze with its eerie brilliance. The high priest's laughter died in his throat as powerful forces gripped his body, catching him in mid-air, leaving him dangling like an abandoned puppet. "It's a miracle," Vesper whispered in disbelief. The squirrel maiden dipped her paw in the shining stream. Praise to the green! Do you not see? We have stumbled upon one of the sacred streams that traverse the forest and connect his holy shrines. The villain is powerless. At last the bloody bones ceased his struggles and stood upon the ditch's brink, trembling with anger and shaking his fists.
Hob, lord of the underworld and greatest of the Wraithshe, hear now the words of thy servant. For his part in allowing the royal maiden Ysabelle to flee, the winged one has chosen his own time of death and is henceforth cursed by that name. Beware the sound of bells, O moon rider, for when thou art surrounded by their clamour, thy death will surely come.
Then the high priest turned to Ysabelle.
From the unfathomable reaches of the pit, the Lord of the Wraithshe comes, and when he does, you shall serve him for eternity in hell's dungeons.
And with that, the high priest vanished into the night. Quickly the green light faded from the stream, and the forest was dark once more. Vesper stared at Ysabelle, and anger overcame his present fright.
This is all thy fault. By thy name I was cursed.
The young bat kicked at the water round him and stomped through it crossly.
I'm away, and shall take my leave, whether you will or no.
The squirrel maiden watched helplessly as Vesper barged away. Fastening the amulet round her neck once more, she cast her gaze desperately about the ditch, and then she saw the high priest's knife embedded in the soft mud. Quickly she ran over and pulled it free. Then, clasping it tightly in her paw, she set off and quickly caught up with Vesper. "Now," she cried, "you are going to obey my commands." The bat felt a sharp pain in his back as Ysabelle pressed the point of the knife against his spine. "If you don't want to die here, then be my guide." The bat sighed wearily.
"Very well. I will show thee the way."
So the pair of them waded further along the ditch until the shadows of the tangled forest engulfed them. Deep below the blistered earth, the high priest descended. Quickly he made for an arched doorway and passed inside. The chamber beyond was large, and the 2 hob lanterns which were fixed to the walls were not enough to illuminate the whole of it. The high priest took from his costume a pouch containing incense and cast a quantity of it into the lamps nearby. As the chamber filled with a sickly sweet smell, a yellow toad appeared, its head waggling and its jowls quivering like jelly. Slowly the bulging eyes closed until only the merest slivers of gold shone in the flickering gloom. Then from its open mouth a cruel voice issued, yet it was not the toad's own. "Tell me, did you find the amulet? Is all well?"
"Alas, the acorn was indeed in my grasp."
"You did not let it slip from you?" the voice shrieked.
"Mistress,"
the bloody bones tried to explain,
"the squirrels were more cunning than I anticipated."
"Idiot! Who has the device now?"
"A maiden, the daughter of the royal house."
"Seek her out and destroy her with your own hand. The acorn must come to me." For nearly an hour, Vesper and Ysabelle had followed the course of the stream, and both were extremely tired and hungry. Then the trickling stream grew even narrower, and the thick mud spread more thickly about the banks. "That's the end of it," Vesper said. "Do you want me to push through those nettles, or do we scramble out of this gully and continue the march up there?" Isabelle looked about them. "I don't like this. Away from the stream, the power of the green no longer protects us. We need a place to hide till dawn." Through a carpet of ground ivy, she led him over to where the shaggy silhouette of a large bramble bush stretched above them. "This will suit our needs." Waving the knife before her, she made Vesper step under the brambles first, then, after gathering up some ivy, followed him in and bound him tightly. "It will be a long march tomorrow," she informed the bat. "You had best get some sleep." Then Ysabelle wrapped herself in her tail, and soon her gentle snores floated on the calm breeze. A low-lying mist rose from the forest floor. Gently at first, Vesper began to wriggle. Then very slowly he started to draw the vines which bound his wings over the thorns. The first of them snapped, then a second, until Vesper's wings were free, and he hurriedly untied his feet. Carefully he crept forward, and not making a sound to disturb the squirrel's slumber, eased the knife from her paw. "So do all tree rats perish. In the name of Revel, I kill thee." The bat drew the blade back and prepared to plunge it deep into her neck, but Ysabelle looked so peaceful sleeping there, with her large eyes lightly closed, and her raven hair flowing like smoke over her shoulders. Vesper felt that if he murdered the squirrel, then he would be accursed forever. I must leave. Hurry from this strange squirrel, whose very existence now mocks you, Vesper." Staggering from the bramble bush, the bat fled from the sleeping Ysabelle and tore through the ground ivy, not knowing what to do. Then a desolate and mournful sound filled his ears. It was the sound of a solitary bell. "No!" he breathed in dismay as he remembered the high priest's curse. The dull clanging drew nearer, and Vesper thought he saw strange shapes within the dense mist. A dark figure loomed before him, and Vesper fell on his face in terror as the ringing seemed to surround his prostrate form. "Please, spare me." But it was Ysabelle who stared down at him. She had awoken to find the bat gone, and to her surprise she was still alive. From a tunnel of hawthorn close by, a peculiar figure now emerged. Into the low-lying mist, a small shrew came hobbling. A dirty bandage was wrapped tightly about its right leg, and it leaned upon a wooden crutch. Over its shoulder a heavy-looking satchel had been slung, and about its waist it wore a belt of string. From the dense fog a resonant voice boomed out. "I have it, Hazel. 2 to the left, 4 summer worms away." Both Vesper and Isabelle watched in fear as the owner of that voice sailed from the mist, attached to the other end of the string. At first they could only see a large hooded shape, wreathed in wisps of vapour and bearing a staff from which a bronze bell dangled. Then, as it lumbered further onto the path, the squirrel maiden squealed in horror. At this, the shrew pulled a short dagger from its satchel and hopped about in a frenzy of excitement.
"Is it hoppers? Is it hoppers?"
"Peas," his stout companion instructed. He was a large mole, and laid a huge spade-like paw upon his friend's shoulder. "Who watches my guide and me? If you be enemies, then be gone. But if you be friendly, will you not join us?" That settled it for Vesper. He shook himself free of the squirrel's paw and trotted down to meet the 2 strangers. "Vespertilio," Ysabelle desperately cried. "Don't you see? The bell. It is the warning sign of the leper." Vesper skidded to a standstill and cringed away. Ysabelle was right. The creature was leprous. In irregular patches, the velvet of his skin had turned white, and in some places had fallen out completely. The young bat began to stutter an apology, but the leper waved him into silence. "Not another word until your friend comes down and joins us." My friend? "I may be near completely blind, but mine ears are as sharp as ever they were." Vesper glanced back to the tree where Ysabelle was still hiding. "Come out." The shrew ambled forward and peered into the misty darkness.
"Oh, 'tis a fair beauty, my master."
"How pleasant. A batling and his lady?"
"No, master, begging your pardon, 'tis a squirrel who approaches."
Isabelle now stood at Vesper's side, and she looked on the 2 strangers much as he had done. "I am Ysabelle," she told the mole, giving Vesper a kick to introduce himself. Vespertilio, he blurted, rubbing his ankle. Ysabelle Vespertilio, the mole repeated, committing them to memory. Now let it be known that under the warm hills of a land not too distant, I was dubbed Giraldus. But let us not stand in the cold like gibbering rats, too witless to notice the icicles dripping from their snouts. Teisel, find something suitable. He let out the string once more, and the shrew went scouting into the mist.
Over here, his high voice soon called. Nice arrangement of logs, not too damp, and cushioned with moss. 4 spring worms straight ahead, then a summer one left.
Following his directions, Giraldus led Ysabelle and Vesper over to his companion. "Tell me," asked the squirrel maiden, "why are you both abroad in the forest at this time of night?" Giraldus squinted down and patted his servant's head. "Teisel and I are on a pilgrimage." "To where?" "Why, to Greenreach." "Why there?" "Is it not written that about the blessed hill the Green himself does walk? Once we are there, my servant and I shall both be cured of our ills, he of his lameness, and I of this accursed leprosy." "Greenreach is where I'm headed," said Ysabelle eagerly, "and if our paths lie together—" Giraldus gave an understanding smile. "Lady, I am a leper, and as such not a fitting companion for anyone." Ysabelle shook her head. "It would be an honour to me if you would let me accompany you." "What about me?" Vesper asked suddenly. "You are free to go. I have 2 guides now. You are a captive no longer." Vesper eyed her uncertainly. He had no desire to brave the vast forest on his own. I think I'll come with you." It was not long before Ysabelle remembered that the last time she had eaten was 2 days ago. On hearing this, Giraldus pulled on the string and sent Teisel off in search of mushrooms. It was then that he explained the method of measuring the shrew's lead. Each particular length related to a memorable worm the mole had once had the pleasure of eating. Spring worms were the shortest, and the longest allowance of string was accounted in autumn rain worms. Given a lead of 20 of the latter, Teisel hurried off, only to reappear some minutes later with a quantity of freshly harvested mushrooms. Together with some bread and cheese which the shrew carried in his satchel, they formed an excellent start to the day, and both Ysabelle and Vesper tucked into the meal with much enthusiasm. The following day the talk ranged over many things, and all learned something about their travelling companions. But eventually the sun began to sink in the heavens once more, and the clear daylight was tinged with the sombre colours of the encroaching evening. "We ought to find shelter," Ysabelle said nervously. "Fear not," Giraldus rumbled, "for we are very close to the next shrine which we must visit, the Orchard of Dure, where the 7 trees were planted by the Green in the time before the winter came to kill the year." Presently the trees which they passed grew very close together, and Teisel was kept busy, shouting his directions to Giraldus, warning him to avoid fallen branches and treacherous roots. But as the darkness deepened about them, no sign of this orchard could they see. Teisel was put on a 20 autumn wormer to scout the way ahead, and as the moon began to shine over the uppermost branches, his excited voice called to them.
"Master, the marker. I've found the marker."
"To think," Giraldus breathed enchantedly, "that once he placed this very boundary here, girdling his orchard, in a last attempt to keep the ice and snow of winter at bay." Vesper stared beyond the tumble-down wall and grimaced at Ysabelle. It was a sad, shabby place. Of the 7 fruit trees mentioned in the old legends, only 3 remained, and everywhere the lesser trees of the forest had sprung up, usurping their position. The soft moonlight filtered through the matted branches, and Ysabelle looked sorrowfully at Giraldus, knowing how disappointed he must feel. But the mole could not see the overcrowded mesh of bough and twig. To his dim-sighted eyes, the place was perfect. "Hazel, is it just as we thought?" The shrew gave the others a look that warned them not to tell his master the truth, then hurried away to find their sleeping quarters. Giraldus leaned his staff against the stone and carefully felt the roughly shapen sides with his fingertips. "Here they are, the inscriptions that Dewar carved into the rock. Can you read them, child?" Ysabelle stared at the marker stone intently. Just visible were a series of grooves and swirls carved into the rock. "No, the writing is too weathered." Vesper frowned at Ysabelle, for he saw no harm in humouring the mole. "Never mind. At least you are here, and a wondrous sight it is." The squirrel maiden turned away, exasperated, but Giraldus grinned and was happy. The oak tree Hazel had found was a squat, gnarled creation whose roots radiated from it in fat, twisting spokes. Not too far from the ground, 2 unshapely branches forked from the trunk, and it was upon these that Vesper and the others were presently sitting. With his eyes reflecting the silver moonlight, the bat scanned the surrounding woodland and clicked his tongue. Nothing. They were alone in that part of the forest. Perhaps this night he could sleep soundly. "Good night, then, and may you get more sleep than you did yesterday, Princess." But the squirrel was already fast asleep. "In the arms of the green," Giraldus muttered to himself, "once more we consign our spirits into thy care." The mole closed his blind eyes and joined his paws over his stout and solid stomach. Then he began to snore. The moon-filled night closed over them, and the long dead leaves of the oak tree rustled in the whispering airs above. Empty hours rolled by. Not even the voice of an owl disturbed the deep hollowness of the dark, and all the forest was still. Much later, a voice spoke in Ysabelle's ear. "Awaken, child." Gradually the maiden surfaced from her dreams and rubbed her bleary eyes. Suddenly Ysabelle sat bolt upright and stared wildly around. A glorious light, like nothing she had ever seen before, now blazed all about her. Gold and green it burned, edging her fur with glittering stars and dancing in her astonished eyes. Ysabelle swayed unsteadily, giddy from the spectacular celebration of life and growth which overwhelmed her senses. "Who's there? Who is it?" "Do you not know, child of the hazel realm?" Ysabelle lifted her gaze and let out a cry of fear. There, amid the shining leaves of the flourishing oak tree, 2 great green eyes stared at her. "Have no fear, for in thee lies the hope of all. Only thou can deliver the land from darkness. Know now that thine army is safe and but a little distance away." "Then the hoppers didn't destroy them?" "Not all perished in the first onslaught." Then the light of the eyes dimmed, and the voice was filled with warning. "Yet have a care, for my heart forewarns that one of thy companions shall betray thee." Ysabelle stared at the sleeping figures nearby. A shocked and stricken expression froze on her face. "Which one?" she asked. "Which is it to be? Who will betray me?" But around her the light was growing dim, and the eyes were fading from sight. "My time with you is at an end. Remember, trust only in thine own self and judgment, and fare thee well." Within moments, Ysabelle was sleeping soundly. So it was that she failed to hear the sound which disturbed the eerie peace of the orchard. From the fathomless, molten reaches beneath the earth there came a tremendous bellowing. In the pit something was stirring and making its terrible way upwards, up to where the squirrel slept, her paws clasped about the blood-stained amulet which the high priest had used to summon it back to the waking world. Early in the morning of the new day, the four travellers left the orchard of Dure and pressed deeper into the forest. Bright sunlight sparkled through the naked branches overhead and shone upon the ground in ripples of bright gold. Giraldus was in fine mood. "By this evening we should reach the last holy place." Vesper laughed. "There's glad tidings. Why, I shall be able to return home. You'll be happy to see the back of me, won't you, Princess?" "I shall not be happy until the acorn is brought to the star-glass," Ysabelle said curtly, "and your kind is driven from Greenreach." Through dense stretches of tall ferns they pushed. As she trod on the brittle leaves, keeping her tail close about her, a disturbing thought occurred to Ysabelle. In this wintry place the power of the green was dormant, and she urged the others to hurry. A hoary rime now covered everything, and the ground was almost too cold to walk over. Threads of icy white mist clung to the trees, throttling them with the numbing death of winter. Suddenly the shrew held up a paw that trembled with more than mere cold, and Ysabelle and Vesper stared at what he had found. "What is it?" Giraldus boomed. The shrew leaned heavily upon his crutch and turned towards his master.
"Hob posts."
Impaled upon sharpened twigs were the bodies of 5 sparrows, and next to them the picked clean skulls of 3 weasels grinned and gaped. "So the cult of the wraith-she is strong hereabouts," Giraldus murmured. "Shh!" hissed Vesper suddenly. Everyone held their breath, and then they heard something was approaching, and they ran for cover behind a tree. "What is it?" asked Giraldus. "Nothing to worry about," Vesper finally chortled. "Only a couple of mice collecting firewood." One of the newcomers pulled the scarf away from his mouth and asked cautiously,
"Did you hear that, Mathilde?"
The second mouse nodded.
"That I did, Pomfrey."
Vesper and Ysabelle stepped from behind the tree, followed by Hazel. The 2 mice squeaked in surprise. Then their mouths fell open and their eyes bulged as Giraldus came ambling after.
"'Tis a leper!"
The one called Pomfrey yelled. "Stay back!" Giraldus roared for silence and told the mice that he would not harm them, after which they relaxed and gruffly introduced themselves.
"Name's Pomfrey, and this be my good lady Mathilde. Excuse the nerves, but you done give us a bit of a start, you did." "Not like it was, is it?"
his wife sadly reflected.
"Got to know who is what, if you live in these parts," Pomfrey explained. "There's been fairer-than-he trapes in these woods that I wouldn't trust."
"Hobbers?"
"Aye. But we're not quitting our snug wee home. Let them go and fight if they can. We didn't want aught to do with it."
Isabelle's head spun, trying to keep up with what the mice were saying. "Do you mean that some of you actually formed an army to fight against the Hobbers?"
"Not us. It were others. They upped and went."
"Where exactly did they go?" Vesper asked. "Was it far away?"
"Don't know, don't care. Good riddance. We doesn't need their company, does we, missus?" "Certainly not. Only accidents ever come of playing with sharp blades, I told them."
"That you did."
"Well, let's not stand here any longer catching our deaths. Pleasant talking with you folks."
Giraldus thumped his staff angrily. "Let fall those burdens which trammel thy journey to the blessed green."
"Master," Hazel chirped, "'tain't no use. They've gone."
"Join us in our noble quest." "I wish those mice had told us where those woodlanders had gone to," said Vesper. "If they really have formed some kind of fighting force against the Hobbers, we might need their help." For the rest of the afternoon they tramped through the frozen forest, and at every turn of the track there was some new sign to remind them in whose country they walked. The severed heads of those who would not join the infernal congregations became a common sight. They met only one other creature, and that was a gaunt rabbit, out foraging for food.
Clear the way, the buck-toothed stranger said crossly. The evening comes, and I've a mind to get away from this place before then. Leave these benighted woods. Escape while you may. Art thou ignorant of the horror which haunts the forest?
The creature's long ears pricked up suddenly, and his mouth fell open as a look of sheer terror spread over his face.
Too late. No more time. They are coming.
With a terrific leap, he jumped over Giraldus and scooted away. Probably just the poor thing's nerves, said Ysabelle. It's growing dark, and he was frightened, that is all. They set off once more, but within moments a high, mocking sound rang through the trees.
Yip, yip, yip.
Giraldus twisted his head to listen. Some kind of bird, no doubt. That was no bird I know of, muttered Vesper. That was a call of some kind. Hoppers, Ysabelle gasped fretfully. They're here, aren't they? So they continued on their way, but from deep within the shadows of the trees which surrounded and pressed in on every side, they began to hear strange voices and rustlings. It was Vesper who saw them first. Look, up there, in the treetops. In the high branches of an elm tree, a large black carrion crow sat hunched and ready. With red-rimmed eyes, it returned the anxious looks of the travellers and gave a croaking cackle. Isabelle shivered and turned away, but her eyes saw a furry shape leap through the darkness, and she took hold of Vesper's wing in fear. They're going to jump out at us. Above them, dozens more crows had alighted. With greedy eyes they watched those passing beneath, and a number sharpened their beaks upon the frozen bark. Hundreds of eyes were shining within the dense forest, cruel narrow slits which burned with savagery and hunger. Then a chant began. Soft at first, it gradually spread until the whole world seemed filled by the raucous and discordant sound.
For fine morsels, see how they run, rip out their hearts until their lives are done, peck out their eyes and do a good job, peel off their skins and give them to hob, 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 hob.
Terror and panic finally overcame Ysabelle. Screaming, she tore down the path. No! Vesper called after her. We mustn't separate. That's what they want. He turned quickly to the others and told them to follow as best they could. As the bat set off, Hazel yanked on the string.
Forward, forward, mind the route at 2 summer worms. Forward, forward, left now.
Then Hazel skidded to a halt. Something was wrong. No answering tug yanked on the string, and he spun round desperately. The string was slack, and his master was not attached to the end of it.
Master! Master!
There was Giraldus, thrashing his staff over his head as a sea of carrion crows plucked and tormented him.
War-bred blood to drip from our beaks, rich ruby honey to slake our thirsts.
Brandishing his tiny knife, the shrew lunged at those who pecked at Giraldus, and so furious was his temper that the birds fell back dismayed.
Get you up,
Hazel said to the mole.
Take the end of my string and fear no more. We'll be no crow bait.
Covering her face and swerving to one side, Ysabelle bounded wildly through the forest away from the path. An outstretched wing wrapped itself around her waist, and she screamed in terror. It's me, cried Vesper, as he fended off her fists. As they ran, black-feathered arrows sang past their heads, and a dagger spiraled through the air, just missing the bat's right ear. We shan't make it, Ysabelle sobbed.
Stop squawking and run.
Plunging further from the path, they came to where a thick hedge covered the ground and barred the way in all directions. Trapped, Ysabelle cried. Not yet, Vesper said, bundling her through a narrow gap and leaping after.
Here we come,
squealed Hazel, dashing through the hedge. Giraldus came lumbering after, his large girth barely managing the narrow way.
The last shrine, Master! We have reached it!
In a small clearing fringed by 12 elder trees and the rambling hedge, the well of Ruas had remained for centuries. It was square in shape, its sides being cut by the cunning craft of those who had lived long ago. But the holy well had become a hideous place, for the children of the Wraithshe had come and left their infernal marks there. Black ice sealed the well head, yet the trapped water within was dark and foul. The hobbers had defiled it with their filth, and the once pure water was polluted beyond redemption. "We cannot remain here," Vesper declared. "It has become an evil, accursed place. I can think of nowhere more dangerous." Giraldus now raised his immense paw and said softly, "Hush, we are not alone." Everyone stared at him. Then from somewhere behind the mutilated elders they heard a voice, and it was sobbing. "Oh, what a sorry pickle you have landed thyself in. Oh, why could he who doled out brains not have bestowed any upon thee, unhappy dolt?" Isabelle caught her breath. She knew that voice. She hurried in the direction from which it came and let out a delighted cry. There, in the dreary shade of the broken trees, sitting upon his cart and with his head in his paws, was Wendell Maculatum. At the sound of the squirrel's voice, the jester leapt to his feet and backed away in terror. A phantom has come to haunt me." Ysabelle smiled. "Wendell, I am no ghost." The stoat wrung his paws before him. "For days I've wandered, lost in the wilds. In terror have I spent my nights, listening to the shrill sounds of those who prowl in the dark. Oh, how mine heart does rejoice now!" Standing a little way behind, Vesper peered at the stoat and frowned. "It does appear to me that you've been extremely fortunate so far." For the first time, Wendell seemed to notice him. "Why, 'tis the Moon Rider. Yet where are his bonds?" Before anyone could answer, he then saw Giraldus and Hazel. "Don't worry," Ysabelle said hastily. "These are all my friends, and the bat has saved my life more than once since last I saw you." "Forgive me, good sirs," Wendell apologized. "In the sudden shock of finding this jewel of the Hazel realm alive, I did forget myself." "I should dearly like to know why the hobbers stopped chasing us," said Vesper, glancing back at the defiled well. "They could have killed us easily." The jester raised a paw to silence him. "Be glad that they did not. Why question such a happy occurrence?" "Because it doesn't make any sense," the bat replied. "Still, we ought to be moving on. We dare not stay here." Giraldus turned his head towards him. "The batling speaks wisely. Let us not linger here." Hazel stuck out his bottom lip. "A sore shame it is that we never found them woodlanders." Wendell pricked up his ears. "Woodlanders? Why, I too have heard of those valiant warriors. Oh, if only we could seek them out, then we would be safe for sure." "Did you learn where they live?" asked Isabelle. The stoat closed his eyes and slapped his forehead, trying to remember. "By the shore of a lake the place was. Now, this very afternoon I did come across a stream. If we followed it, then most certainly it would guide us there." "But it could lead either to or from the lake," Vesper protested. "That's if it has anything to do with it at all." Isabelle folded her arms and glared at the young bat. "I think the plan has merit." So, against Vesper's better judgment, it was decided to hurry to the stream and follow it. Taking the handles of his cart, Wendell led them further away from where the path cut through the forest, and reluctantly Vesper trailed behind. Eventually the trees began to thin out, and patches of sky appeared through the thick canopy above. The frozen stream grew wider, the ground dipped in a gentle slope, and then they saw it, the lake. It was a cheerless, dreary place. Clouds of gnats hovered about the shore, and a stagnant reek poured out from the centre of that silent mere. "'Tis a foul, stinking place that you have brought us to," Vesper told the jester. Wendell sat on his cart and shrugged. "Be that as it may, but if those gallant foes of the enemy do dwell hereabouts, then, for the gracious lady's sake, should we not do our utmost to discover them?" "And how do we do that?" Giraldus inquired. "We light a fire." It was a matter of minutes for them to collect enough sticks and branches, and presently tongues of yellow flame crackled into life. The fire did much to lift their spirits, for it dispelled the all-pervading gloom, and they toasted their palms gladly before the flames. After a short while, Wendell pattered away and began searching beneath the willows. There he discovered a chunk of wood, which he brought back to the campfire and began carving with a sharp little knife.
"What is it you make?"
Hazel asked at length. "A puppet, of course. Perhaps I'll fashion it into the likeness of a shrew." Hazel beamed from ear to ear.
"Wouldst thou, really?"
Rising, Ysabelle declared, "I think I shall take a walk before I close my eyes. Do not fear, I shan't go far, just along the shore a little way." The squirrel strolled beside the dark, icy water, staring at times at her own distorted reflection. The acorn about her neck gleamed in the stagnant mirror, and she touched it reverently. Suddenly she gasped, and sharply pulled her paw away. The amulet had burnt her fingers. Then, from many leagues beneath the earth, a dreadful roar thundered. Great ripples fanned out towards the centre of the enormous pool, churning the scum which covered the surface, and the nauseous smell grew stronger. "Hob!" she gasped. "It's him! He's coming for me!" Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roaring ceased. Shivering with fear, Ysabelle turned and fled. The campfire was still burning when Ysabelle took her place beside it. Only Wendell had remained awake, and he pressed a finger to his lips when he saw her. "How does the puppet progress?" she whispered. Wendell shaved off some irregular bumps before showing it to her. "Soon I shall paint it, then make the body from some cloth. I hope it will amuse those who see it, but for myself I am too tired." She yawned and spread dry leaves and grasses over the ground where she would sleep. Wendell watched her all the while until he finally put his work down. "May those sprites who grant peaceful slumber visit you and bear thee to a fairer place than this in thy dreams." Isabelle lay down on the prepared ground and made herself comfortable as the stoat wandered over to his cart and took a reed pipe from one of the chests. Then, sitting just beyond the circle of firelight so that the dancing glow illuminated only the tip of his nose, he put it to his lips. A slow, drowsy tune floated from the instrument. It was a lulling melody that dragged Ysabelle's eyelids down and poured sleep into her ears. Then suddenly she awoke. "What was that? Vespertilia? He is in danger." Taking up her long knife, she dashed forward. Vesper had been sitting thoughtfully upon the shore. His heart was troubled, but when the strains of Wendell's melodic music reached him, he had forgotten his sorrows, and it had been a struggle to remain awake. As his head nodded for the third time, the bat sat up with a jolt, rubbed his eyes, and realized that he was not alone. In the middle of the loathsome mere, vile shapes writhed and twisted, bundles of bones, scale, and rotting pondweeds, bound together and animated by malevolent spirits. Out of the stinking water they rose, dripping filth and slime as they reared. Up into the reeking air the horrors floated. Then they began to move swiftly towards the shore. Vesper tried to run, but the vile phantoms were too quick, and a mangled claw flashed out, grabbing him by the neck. Down to the water's edge they dragged the kicking and wailing bat. Into the sinister lake the two grisly apparitions hauled him, pulling the moon rider into their freezing and unholy grave. As she ran along the shore, following the bat's urgent screams, the squirrel maiden had seen the ghoulish apparitions drag the young bat into the mire. Without pausing to think, Ysabelle leaped from the edge and plunged into the lake. The knife thrashed in the water as she hacked blindly. Through putrid fish skin and brittle bones it tore, cutting a path through to the stricken moonrider. The lake seethed as the spectres turned their fury upon the squirrel, but Ysabelle's desperation had made her fearless. With a tremendous shout, she spun round and brought the knife crashing down. Splinters of wood and fragments of diseased scale exploded about her as the hellish claws flew apart. Swiftly, Ysabelle seized the moment and rushed towards the shore, trawling Vesper after her. "Vespertilio, can you stand?" I think so," he coughed. "Then do it. There are more of the foul creatures. They're attacking the others." Two of the ghastly spirit-enslaved jumbles had snatched the shrew and were now bearing him towards the lake. "Master!" Hazel called. "Master!" The string which joined them was taut, and Giraldus drove his staff into the icy mud with all his might and clung to it desperately. The string creaked, and the progress of the spectres was halted. Into this horrible scene, Ysabelle and Vesper came tearing. "Get Hazel!" the bat called to her. Ysabelle stabbed the grizzle and knotted twigs which clutched him, and Vesper tore the smothering black weed from Hazel's face. But the spectres were not about to let him go so easily, and frantically wrapped more slimy strands about his body, dragging him into the foul water. "Into the dark, we will take your life. Follow us down, moulder with us." "Vespertilio," Ysabelle pleaded, "help me, Hazel will drown." But Vesper was not there. She looked round and saw the moonrider charging back to the lake with a burning branch plucked from the campfire in his grasp. "No!" the hollow voices shrieked. "Not the burning fires, no!" They fell back before the flames, their claws and tendrils snaking away from Hazel and leaving the shrew free to clamber back to shore. Vesper and Ysabelle strode about the water's edge, making sure the unholy spirits sank below the surface. The grim lake was still and silent once more, but they were certain that hostile eyes still watched them. Then from out of the trees where the forest began, a tall figure bashfully stepped. Hazel saw him first, and his face cracked into an enormous grin. "Wendell!" The stoat wrung his paws. "How can you forgive me when the first of those slimy horrors rose from the dank water? I did squeal and hair into the trees. Dear friends, forgive me, I beseech thee." "You had best collect your cart," Ysabelle said coldly. "We are not staying here." Vesper shook his head in disgust, then hurried to catch up with Ysabelle. "You did save my life in that stinksome mere. You acted most bravely, and I am in thy debt." "Call it a debt repaid," Ysabelle said with a smile. And so the 5 travellers passed once more into the forest, and the haunted mere was left far behind. A bleary dawn edged into the heavens as within a hollow tree the travellers slept on. Vesper nuzzled his face into his wing, lost in a deep slumber. That night he had been too exhausted to dream, and no images of the high priest came to haunt him. He rolled over, but from the hole in the trunk a bright beam of sunlight came slanting in, and he unwittingly brought his face directly into it. Grudgingly, he sat up and gazed sleepily at the outside world. Then his ears twitched, and he caught his breath. Someone was out there. "How much longer can this plaguey hunt continue?" complained a voice. "Till the enemy is found and captured," said another. Vesper uttered a startled cry. It was a couple of bats he was listening to. As their conversation continued, Vesper's mind reeled and whirled in a confusing clash of thoughts. The first thing he wanted to do was rush out of the tree and declare his presence. He ventured closer to the opening in the trunk, but stopped himself just in time.
"Ha!" shrieked one of the bats. "Was that not a fine night, when we were victorious over that stinking colony? How those tree rats fled before the fire eggs! Didst thou see that circle of hazel trees ablaze?"
Vesper felt sick, and he looked guiltily across to where Ysabelle soundly slept. The young bat gazed at her lovely face, and knowing what would happen if his kind caught her, turned cold and looked away. He could never betray her. Not now. The bats continued to grumble to one another until they finally decided it was time to resume the search. With a beat of their leathery wings, the moon riders rose from the branches of the dead tree and disappeared over the forest roof. A short while later, the young bat crawled from the hollow tree and stepped outside. Lazily he flapped his wings, and to his astonishment and joy, he began to rise from the ground. "My wing! It has healed. I can fly." He was so happy that he did not know what to do. "I could leave now," he told himself, "fly back to my home." But then, as a feeling he had never thought possible kindled in his heart, he knew that he could never leave. It was not until midday that the others stirred, and as there was nothing to eat for breakfast, the company set off as soon as they were ready. The day continued fine and warm, and it was heartening to see that spring seemed to have arrived in that part of the forest at last. Gone were the cascading icicles, and the ground was soft underfoot. Eventually the path led them to a beautifully sunny glade, and Ysabelle clapped her paws in delight. Growing there were hundreds of daffodils, and their golden trumpets mirrored the sunshine, casting buttery lights that danced about the clearing as the flowers gently nodded and swayed. "Is it not a marvellous sight? May we rest here a while?" The others agreed, and they trailed into the daffodil glade like merry children. Whistling a jaunty little ditty, Wendell took the carving from one of his prop chests and resumed his work on it. Hazel beamed, intoxicated by the glamour of the flowers and the jester's skill. The wooden head was nearly finished. All it needed was careful painting. Suddenly Giraldus cocked his head to one side, and a frown wrinkled his mottled brow. "'Tis time we set off. Come, Hazel." Just as the shrew rose to his feet, an arrow flew through the air and embedded itself in the ground where he had been sitting.
"Hoppers!"
"Hold!" commanded the attackers.
"Move, and you die!"
24 fully armed and stern-looking animals formed a tight circle about them. There were mice and hedgehogs, rabbits and weasels, and all were robed in cloaks of dark green.
"What have we here?"
one of the mice snarled, leering at Giraldus.
"A scab-riddled mole tied to a shrew. The children of the Wraith she must be desperate indeed if they are recruiting from the infirm and diseased."
From the surrounding trees now strode a remarkably tall mouse. Like the others, he wore a cloak of green, but fastened about his neck a silver badge in the shape of a leaping hare gleamed in the sunlight.
"Captain," a hedgehog declared, "see what trespassers we have captured."
The mouse looked at each of them in turn.
"Now here is a strange spectacle. A bat and a squirrel travelling together. What are you doing here?"
Isabelle folded her arms and gazed back at him haughtily. "I am the daughter of Ninea, last of the royal house of the Hazel, and these are my companions. Our quest is a noble one, and if we succeed, then the Wraith she will be only a memory again, and the followers of that fiendish high priest will be vanquished forever."
"This is not the place for such talk," the mouse said quickly. "I have decided the strangers are to come back with us."
He gave a signal to the woodlanders, and in raising their weapons they flanked the 5 travellers on either side. Wedged between 3 mice and a rabbit, Wendell took up the handles of his cart. Tysel was put on a short one-spring wormer, and Giraldus muttered to himself. Then they set off, and the enchanting glade of daffodils was soon far behind. Eventually the ground began to rise, and up a steep incline they all trudged, up to where a bare, grassy mound reared amid the encircling woods. Now Fenny, who was at the front, called out, "Open up, 'tis I, Fenny, returned." The dandelions shook, and their stems parted to reveal a recess in the hillside, which ended at a stout wooden door peppered with studs of iron.
"What is the flower which blooms in the summer?"
squeaked a voice from behind the door.
"The meadow sage."
The door swung open, and the owner of the voice waved them inside. Beyond the entrance an enormous hall opened out, upheld by many strong beams, and cut into the curving earthen walls. Countless tunnels radiated in all directions. The 5 travellers were now marched into one of the smaller passageways that led to a small, heavily barred chamber.
"Inside," said Fenny. "Hurry now."
Vesper gazed in puzzlement at the cramped straw-strewn room and looked curiously at the mouse captain, whose face was set and stern. Only Ysabelle hung back. "Why are you consigning us here? Have I not made it clear just how important is my mission?"
"What manner of simpleton do you reckon me?" Fenny cried. "Addled you hobbers are,"
and with a heave of his paws he slammed the door shut and locked them inside.
"Far from this locked room none of you shall ever leave. In here shall you be imprisoned for the rest of your days."
As the woodlanders' footsteps faded from earshot, Ysabelle looked desperately at Vesper, and in the corner of the chamber Wendell sniffled into his paws.
"Trapped," the stoat wept, "for the rest of our days."
For nearly an hour they remained locked within that small cell, too despondent to talk, and with only the unhappy sniffs of Wendell to break the oppressive silence. Then Giraldus looked up. "Someone approaches," he whispered, and in a moment they all heard the sound of footsteps tramping down the tunnel towards them.
"A dismal quiet is this," said the voice of Captain Fenny as the mouse looked in at the bars. "Where are your protestations now, daughter of Ninia?"
Ysabelle regarded him with disdain. "I shall not waste any more words on you." The mouse scowled.
"If you persist in concealing your true intentions, then no food shall be sent unto you until I decree otherwise."
He whirled round and was about to storm back along the passage when a small vole came rushing up to him, breathless and panting.
"Captain, 'tis from the lower depths I've come. Of those you have recently captured and now hold prisoners, 2 of their number must be sent down at once."
"Why?" the vole replied in a whisper.
"The ancient orders it."
"Which of the prisoners are to be sent?"
"The Moon Rider and the Squirrel Maiden."
Soon Vesper and Ysabelle crossed the great hall once more, and then followed Fenny into a tunnel that seemed to curve steadily round in an ever-descending spiral. Deep below the mound they journeyed, their way lit by small lanterns which were suspended from the earthen ceiling at long intervals. The smell in that gloomy place was like the stale, dry must of old hay. No other scents drifted on the still airs. Only a centuries-old, muted aroma of great age and shabby neglect tingled like pepper in their nostrils. Down a flight of granite steps, carved with many swirls and interlocking circles, the mouse led them until they found themselves standing in an arched cave.
"Welcome,"
said a voice in the darkness, and at that sound Fenny fell on one knee, humbly lowering his head.
"Yes, welcome to thee, Captain Fenlon Portfoot. Welcome to thee, Ysabelle, daughter of Nenia and Silenus. And finally welcome to thee, Vesper, a true knight of the moon, despite thy tender years. Then Ysabelle and Vesper saw him, the ancient. There, sitting in a shallow dip in the floor, brindled with extreme age and with his eyes closed in meditation, was a great and wizened hare. Ysabelle uttered a cry of surprise, and Fenny fell to his knees once again. The messenger of the moon goddess, Vesper breathed in hushed respect. Then he, like Fenny, sank to his knees and prostrated himself before this awesome creature. What do you want of us? Ysabelle asked in a tremulous voice.
Yes, come forward, child of the hazel. Mine eyes would see the countenance of the new Starwife.
Ysabelle obeyed, and the silver eyes gazed long at her, fixing at last upon the acorn around her neck.
A dreadful burden is laid upon thee. In thy paws are the fates of many herald.
I shall not be alone. My army awaits me at Greenwich. At this, Vesper stirred and looked at her suspiciously. How could she know that?
And if thy forces can rid the land of the bats,
asked the ancient, then shall I take up the Starwife ship and rule as my predecessors before me? The silver eyes stared at her a moment longer. Then the ancient called for Vesper to approach.
Vesper, why dost thou journey and keep company with a mortal enemy of thine own race? What has made thee turn?
I have not done such a black deed, cried the bat. I have betrayed no one. The ancient laughed kindly.
That I know. Yours is a true heart. Most proud should thy mother be of her offspring. Now do I pronounce mine judgment. Fenlin, Porefoot, rise and approach.
The mouse captain staggered to his feet and came to stand beside Vesper. What is your will, ancient?
Those who do think themselves safe from the advancing hordes shall be proved cruelly wrong when they strike. The land shall flow with blood, and the children of the Triad shall carouse in rivers of crimson.
Fenny lifted his face, and despair was ingrained upon it. Are we all to fall? The silver eyes closed, and the ancient sighed.
It need not be so. The vision of darkness I have shown unto you can still be averted.
Then how? Asked Isabelle.
Only if all the enemies of the Triad unite and do battle together can this be done. Vesper, hearken to me now, and know the destiny which is mapped out for thee.
The bat flinched, but he could not tear his eyes from those which now blazed fiercely before him with a radiance all their own.
Thy duty it shall be to bring the two opposing forces together, bat and squirrel.
But I cannot, Vesper spluttered. Such a thing is impossible.
Listen to me, Vesper. Thy true enemy was never the Starwife, but none other than the Lord Rathel himself. He it was who denied the birthright of his fellows. The gifts of the lady were a danger to him, for with their aid thy kind would see into his black heart, and the dark malice that simmered there would be revealed.
Vesper was too stunned by this awful revelation to think. But what can I do?
At that, a mole came up to Vesper, carrying a leather bag, and strapped it about the bat's shoulders.
"The herbs and powders that pouch contains will summon all thy kind. Shouldst thou cast it into a fire, then all knights of the moon will gather, and they shall attend on thee then."
The ancient's gaze now turned to Ysabelle.
"About thy neck the acorn is stained with blood, and by that blood was Hob invoked. How many times hast thou heard the unholy one?"
"Oh, only once, by the shore of the haunted mere last night."
"Then only one day remains, for assuredly tonight thou shalt hear him again. But on the third occasion Hob will come. Unless the acorn is brought to the star-glass before that time, no power on earth can stop him, and thou, daughter of Nenia, shall be his first victim."
In stricken silence, Fenny led the others back up the stairs and along the winding tunnels. Ysabelle clasped her amulet fearfully. There was so little time, and yet so much still had to be done. But the squirrel maiden did not know that when she had heard Hob bellowing beneath her, it was in truth the second night of his awakening. If she had realized that, then she would have abandoned all hope completely. The sun was low over the treetops, gilding the new spring leaves when Fenny guided the others from the mound. Released from their prison, Wendell joined them, but Giraldus and Hazel remained to explore some of the underground tunnels. The whole world seemed calm and peaceful, bathed in the mellow radiance of dusk.
"Climb with me to the top of the hill,"
Fenny told Ysabelle and Vesper. Through the lush, daisy-freckled grass they went, until at last they reached the top, and as they caught their breaths, a most unexpected and marvellous sight awaited.
"There she is,"
Fenny declared, unsheathing his sword and pointing it into the hazy distance.
"Rising above the forest roof, a large hill far greater than the one on which they stood reared into the dimming sky. There, unmistakably, was the land of Greenreach."
"The Holy Land," Ysabelle breathed.
"Barely a day's march away," Fenny told her. "If we set out at first light, then by the evening we shall arrive there."
Ysabelle continued to gaze at the distant hill, for there her destiny or doom awaited her. "I should like to remain here a little while longer." The mouse captain bowed.
"Then I shall take my leave of you. A feast we shall give, and come the morning, if it is still your wish, with you shall we go."
"Thank you. We would be delighted to sit at your table."
"So be it," said Fenny, and he began to descend.
Ysabelle stared out over the forest. Her fate lay upon that immense hill, and her mind was filled with nothing but dread. "This will be our last night as we are, for tomorrow our lives will change and be sundered forever." Vesper looked at the ground. "I wish it were not so." "Why is that?" As the last rays of the setting sun shone faintly over the grassy mound, Vesper gazed deep into Ysabelle's eyes and brought her close. The lips of the bat touched those of the squirrel maiden, and for an instant all their cares melted and were forgotten. "Let us not think of tomorrow," Vesper said gently. "This night let all thoughts of darkness and horror be forgotten." Not far away, with a secret smile traced over his face, Wendell crouched out of sight, not wanting the couple to see him. The jester crawled down the mound as silently as he could and slunk over to a patch of weeds, where he took from a pouch around his belt a small cone of incense. "Now," he whispered, "the time has come." With his tinderbox he lit the strange cone, and as a thread of smoke curled into the air, the stoat backed away and hurriedly sought the iron-studded doorway to the mound once more. That evening, in the great hall, the folk of the mound held a feast for their guests. It was partly to make up for the way the visitors had first been treated, but it was also a farewell to that place which for so long had been the woodlanders' home and stronghold. Each family brought their own speciality to the celebration, and sat upon stools, benches, chairs, or piles of cushions around the splendid display. There were herb soups, walnut and hazel pies, fennel and oak apple pasties, 12 kinds of stew and mash of vegetables, freshly baked bread still warm from the oven, all steaming with delicious scents that set Tysel drooling. When just about everyone had finished eating, Wendell waved his arms to gain everyone's attention and announced that he would only be too glad to entertain them if they so desired. Amidst great applause and banging of fists on tables, the stoat wheeled his cart into the centre of the gathering and at once began to juggle, whilst roaring scandalous jokes to the delight of the audience. The mole eyed him disdainfully. He did not care for the fellow's irreverent humour, and it occurred to him that he might aid his digestion by having a little nap. He pulled gently on the string and noticed with dismay that Tysel took longer than usual to respond, and when he did arrive, it was with some reluctance. "Do not worry thyself," Giraldus said in a dejected tone. "If you could but guide me to some out-of-the-way corner where I might rest a while and close mine eyes, I should be grateful." Thus Tysel directed his master over to a shallow cave just off the hall and made him comfortable on the small bed there. "Go now," Giraldus said, "and enjoy the stoat whilst I slumber." So, on a lengthy 43 autumn rain-warmer, Tysel left his master. Wendell had been an enormous success, and the woodlanders demanded that he entertain them once more before the night was through, and with a flamboyant bow the jester agreed. No one was near the stoat's cart when Tysel approached, and he reached out a paw to touch the garish paintwork. Bright flourishes and scrolls twisted over the boards, and his eyes gazed fixedly at the prop chests.
"I suppose them chests is locked anyhow,"
the shrew mumbled to himself. He flicked at the catch on the one nearest to him, and the lid lifted a little.
"What do you think you be doing, Tysel Simpkin?" he asked himself in surprise. "You just get away from here."
But his fingers had closed about the cart's handles, and before he knew what was happening, the shrew had wheeled it into an empty passage, away from the noise and any curious eyes. Carefully he opened one of the chests, and his shining eyes looked inside. At once 2 painted moths flew out. Delighted, the shrew took up another, in which he discovered some scarlet cloth.
"Funny, 'tis a sort of garment, a costume with peculiar stitching running all across."
His voice evaporated into nothing, as a vivid memory flooded before his eyes. It was the night of a hobber's attack. His sister's screams were deafening his ears, and vicious claws dragged him from their riverside home. Here, held in his shaking paws, was the very costume one of the evil fiends had worn, a ghastly representation of a bloody bones.
Wendell, it's him. Master, I must tell my master."
But before he could take up his crutch and leap from the cart, his string gave a sharp tug. Giraldus needed him. Tysel whirled round, but there was Wendell himself, and in his fist he was holding the string. The lips of the stoat parted, and he bared his sharp teeth unpleasantly as a cold chuckle gargled from his throat.
"No!"
Tysel screamed, desperately trying to untie the lead.
"No!"
Wendell Maculatum, high priest of the Wraith She, laughed wickedly as he drew a knife from his belt. "Now join the rest of thy family, halt-footed one." The knife glittered. Tysel screamed once more. Then his voice was silenced. Giraldus shook himself and sat upright in a dreadful daze. For some unknown reason he felt anxious. Trembling, he clutched at the string and tugged on it. Then, to his dismay and unending horror, he held the end of the string in his paws. Where once Tysel, his faithful friend and guide, had been, the lead was now shredded and smeared in fresh, sticky blood. Giraldus threw back his head, and his despairing howl shook the mound. Everyone gathered before the entrance of the sleeping chamber. Yet though the leper shrieked and moaned, no one dared to approach for fear of his disease. "Oh, Wendell," Ysabelle murmured, "what do you think has happened?" "I know not," the evil creature said with practised innocence. "I pray the little fellow is not too badly harmed." They stared with wide eyes as Fenny and Vesper followed the scarlet trail made by the severed rope and sprang into the darkness of the tunnel. The tension was too much for the squirrel maiden to bear. "I'm going to follow them." But before she reached the tunnel, Vesper came staggering out, his face a mask of horror and revulsion. The little shrew has been peeled."
"Peeled?"
shrieked a startled weasel.
"Bloody boned?"
squeaked a group of mice.
"It means," shouted Fenny, "that we have a member of the hob cult among our number."
Just then an urgent hammering sounded upon the door of the main entrance. Everyone spun around as a scared-looking sentry came charging inside.
"The hobbers! They're on the move!" "Where are they?" Fenny asked. "Not far, but so many. Never have I seen such a hellish host."
"They are coming here."
"What can we do?"
the woodlanders squeaked in dismay.
"Take up your weapons," Fenny declared. "The time of hiding is finally over. We must fight the enemy on our very threshold."
As the terrified folk rushed to arm themselves, the mouse captain spoke quickly to Ysabelle.
"Go swiftly from this place before the battle commences."
"But what of you?"
"We cannot leave now. Flee while you may."
Suddenly the sound of many fists battered against the door, and the muffled shrieks of the children of the Wraith-she screamed on the other side. "There must be hundreds of them out there," Ysabelle breathed. "Listen to their evil voices." Fenny ran over to where Vesper stood with a knife in his grasp.
"Moonrider, take the maiden."
Ysabelle looked about them. "Wendell, where are you?" From out of the confusion the jester came hurrying. A look of panic was on his face, and under his arm he carried a small black prop box. "Come with me," she told him. "Fenny has shown us a way of escape."
"Has he indeed?" the stoat muttered, with the faintest of smirks upon his face. "Then most certainly will I join thee."
The mouse captain saluted as they raced towards the tunnel.
"May the green guide you. Let the Starwife reign once more."
Into the mound the children of the Wraith-she now surged.
"In the ancient's name," the woodland folk cried. "Death to the hobbers!"
With the night air flooding the open hall and the stars glittering high in the heavens, the battle commenced, and the bloody heaps of dead swiftly mounted. Through dimly lit passageways the escaping travellers hurtled. With blood pounding in their veins, they heard the clashes of steel against steel as the uproar of the fighting and the yells of the invading hordes echoed throughout the underground. "The hobbers are pursuing," Ysabelle shouted to Vesper. "Can we not go faster?" "Leave me behind," Giraldus boomed. "'Tis I who impede your escape." "We shall leave no one. Is that not so, Wendell?" But no answer came from the stoat. "Vesper, the jester is missing." "He must have stumbled and fallen," Vesper said. "Did you hear nothing?" Even as he spoke, the passage grew brighter as a fiery orange glow spread over the walls and a hollow chuckle rang in their ears. Two dazzling eyes that dripped with flame came blazing forward, and Ysabelle clutched Vesper for support as they beheld the bearer of the hob lantern. "At last, I have you," Wendell gloated. "Alone in the deeps of the world, you are mine." He slid a blood-stained knife from a gash in the false flesh of the revolting bloody bones costume he now wore, and held it threateningly before Ysabelle's face. Vesper's eyes flashed angrily at the evil stoat. "If you touch her, I will kill you." "I have no need to put myself at risk," came the wicked reply. "My followers are approaching. It is they who will kill you." Furiously, Giraldus struck the wall with his fist and roared, "You were the one who butchered my Hazel." A horrible scream issued from the mole's throat, and his massive paws grabbed Wendell by the neck, squeezing until his eyes bulged from their sockets. "Giraldus," cried Ysabelle, "stop it!" "Do not halt me in this. I will be avenged for Hazel." But Ysabelle pleaded with him, and Giraldus threw the high priest to the ground in disgust. "Quickly," she told Vesper, "help me remove the ghoulish vestments from him." Hastily they tore at the bloody bones costume, dragging the crimson sinews from the stoat's body. Then, without hesitation, Ysabelle pulled the grisly raiment over her head and snatched up the hob lantern. Down the passageway the surging mob came, and there, standing before them with its claw raised, was the bloody bones. Under the mask, beads of perspiration trickled down Ysabelle's brow as she sought for something to say to these nightmares. "Go back," she cried in as deep a voice as she could manage. "Return to the upper levels." The rats stared at her dubiously. "Be gone! Go, I say!" Grudgingly the hobbers turned and began to traipse up the tunnel. "Come," said Ysabelle to the other two, "let us be gone." So they set off down the passage, and as she ran, Ysabelle gladly tore the cadaverous disguise from her body. Giraldus bounded blindly along, dragging the high priest with him. They ran as fast as they could for some minutes. Then the tunnel curved again, but when they turned the corner, Vesper cried out in dismay. "It's blocked! The roof has caved in." Behind them a wooden beam gave an ominous creak, and loose soil trickled down from the sagging ceiling. "Listen," breathed Vesper. "The entire tunnel is on the verge of collapse." Giraldus closed his eyes and stepped up to the wall of earth. If my wits are not addled, I would say that this barrier is only one spring wormer in depth. Stand aside." Blowing upon his leprous palms, the mole spread his arms wide, then gritting his teeth, he dived at the soil. Swiftly the tunnel began to clear, and while they watched, no one paid any attention to the trussed and tied Wendell, who began feverishly gnawing at his bonds. Suddenly a draught of cool night air blew into the passageway as Giraldus finally broke through. But Wendell had also been successful. As soon as the last loop of the string broke in his jaws, he leapt away, yelling at the top of his voice. "Children of the Wraith She, there are enemies here. I need your aid." Before the stoat could say more, Giraldus slammed him against the wall, and as the tunnel juddered threateningly, he turned to Ysabelle. "Take the battling and go." As Ysabelle and Vesper stared, he lifted Wendell into the air and cracked his head upon the earthen ceiling. Yet the stoat was sly and countered his assailant's strength with low cunning and agility by throwing dirt into the mole's face. As the leper spluttered, the foul creature snatched up a splintered shard of wood and rammed it deep into his shoulder. From just outside now, Vesper and Ysabelle stared helplessly at the bitter duel. "I'm going back in there," the bat cried. "He needs help." "It's too late. Look." In the tunnel, Wendell crowed in triumph as the mole fell limply to the floor. And then the tunnel was filled with the uproar of the hobbers as they came pouring in, knives and spears flashing, all ready for murder. With a terrible scream, the rats dashed forward. Yet even as the stoat flung his head back to laugh, the eyes of Giraldus flickered open. "Green, be with you," he called, and summoning all his dwindling strength, he gave a tremendous heave on one of the supporting beams. With a thunderous explosion of earth and stone, the tunnel roof collapsed on top of them all. "Giraldus," Isabelle murmured. "Oh, Vespertilio." They're all crushed under there, buried alive." Vesper looked about them. "Come on. Giraldus did it so we could escape. Quick, hold on to me." With a beat of his wings, the bat rose into the air, and before the squirrel maiden could gasp her surprise, she had wrapped her arms about him and was lifted from the ground. But the danger was not over, for as they soared above the treetops, Ysabelle could see that hundreds of gore crows, ravens, jackdaws, and magpies were circling and shrieking. It was apparent that the rats were telling them what had happened, and with a thrash of their ebony wings, the hellish birds tore through the night sky in wrathful pursuit. Over the starlit forest, Vesper and Ysabelle flew. The bat furiously beat his wings, but his exertions were almost too much to bear. Gradually, the evil birds were gaining, advancing with every passing second, and their blood-curdling cries trumpeted across the starry heavens.
"Strike them down, tear and rend with claw and beak."
Despite his fear, Vesper's wings began to beat more slowly, until, with a sickening lurch, they toppled from the sky and spiraled downwards. "We must alight," Vesper panted. "I fear my damaged wing has not healed as much as I did think." "But we're so near," Isabelle urged. "Only a few leagues more and we should be there." Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a black shape dived through the leaves of a sycamore and raced straight for them. Before Vesper had a chance to act, the creature bore down on him. A gnarled talon flashed out and struck the bat across the face. Emitting a frightened yell, Vesper plummeted down, and they crashed with a sickening thud. Ysabelle rolled helplessly down the sloping lawns, but Vesper crumpled into a fearful heap of wing and fur, and lay still as death. The cold, crackling voice of the crow rang overhead as it fluttered in a wide circle, delighted at the violence it had wrought.
"Victuals! Delicious corpse flesh! Shall I peck out the eyes first, or guzzle the entrails?"
It landed on top of Vesper, and its midnight feathers smothered his face. Then, without warning, a wild creature darted from the shadows, and fierce paws gripped the crow's tail feathers, tearing the quills out by the roots. "Get away from him, you foul hopper!" Ysabelle yelled. The bird shrieked in pain as it whirled round to face its attacker, but a fallen branch came swinging down and struck it across its beak. Reeling backwards, it staggered from Vesper's body, and with blood pouring from its wounded face, took to the air in blind fear. "Vespertilio!" Ysabelle called. "Vespertilio!" The young bat made no answer, and with trembling fingers she touched his chest. "Green be praised," she whispered, for there she had felt a faint heartbeat. For some time Ysabelle knelt at Vesper's side, holding his head and repeating his name, but only the sounds of the still night filled her ears, and an unhappy tear rolled down her cheek. Beneath the unlit and shadow-enshrouded trees, something heard her plaintive weeping. A deep hood covered the face of the stranger, but within its void 2 eyes regarded the forlorn Ysabelle. The figure took a step closer, and at last it spoke. "A strange spectacle is this. What sign or wonder have I discovered in the haunted realm of night?" Ysabelle held Vesper tightly as the cloaked form glided towards them with one paw outstretched. "Keep that distance," she warned. Gentle laughter issued from the depths of the all-concealing hood. "I mean you no harm, but thy companion is injured. He must receive help if he is to live." The stranger slowly drew the hood from its head. You are a squirrel," Ysabelle spluttered, overjoyed beyond belief. "Thus do you see my dilemma," returned the other, "a maiden of my own race nursing one of those accursed rats with wings. Please, is there anything you can do for him?" "You crave the bat to be attended to? Then we must go now." "Wait," Isabelle called. "What help is there? Who are you afraid of? Is it the hoppers?" So many questions. Did you not know that you lie at the foot of the slopes of Greenreach? "The Holy Land," Isabelle marvelled. "But that is excellent tidings." Lowering her head, she gazed sadly at the bat and slowly stroked his hair. "Oh, Vespertilio, most courageous of moonriders, you did make it to the Holy Land after all. We did cheat the hoppers." Resting Vesper's head upon the grass, Isabelle rose from her knees. Gingerly she lifted the silver acorn, and immediately the stranger gasped. "The amulet of the Starwives. Hope beyond all reason and daring has come to us. Then truly art thou the chosen one? But forgive me, may I know the name of my new mistress?" "I am Ysabelle, daughter of Ninea, the last of that royal house." "You must take the amulet to the star-glass at once," the cloaked figure said. "What about Vespertilio? I cannot leave him here." "Does the hazel realm love the company of bats so much that it would see the downfall of us all?" Ysabelle nodded. "You are right. I will go to the star-glass." But before she set off, the squirrel maiden kissed Vesper's forehead, then hid him beneath a covering of leaves. "It will not be long. I will return for thee." With a last lingering look at Vesper's concealed form, Ysabelle turned to the stranger. "Good friend, may I presume upon thee to learn how thou art named?" The other pulled the hood over her face once more. "Call me Moena." And so Ysabelle was parted from Vesper, and she melted into the darkness on the slopes of Greenreach. Moena seemed to disregard all need for secrecy, and marched up the hillside quite openly. Ysabelle was shocked at the extent of the destruction. No blade of grass, no green shoot, and no spring bud had survived. "It is a nightmare we walk into," she said to Moena. The cindered soil under their feet was warm and smouldering now. From gaping cracks in the ground, trails of smoke curled slowly into the night. "In the trees," Ysabelle gasped. "Look!" Silhouetted against the stars, the spindly frames of the blasted trees could be clearly discerned. Yet amongst the clumps of ash which draped across the blackened boughs like tattered war banners, small figures crouched and glared down. "Bats! There are hundreds, no thousands of bats all around us." Moena pulled her close. "Be silent, my lady. The forces of Rethel might not harm us. Come, quickly." Through a pool of cold, feathery ash she led the maiden, and the summit of the hill drew near. Breathlessly, Ysabelle longed to turn and flee, but she knew that was impossible now. It was too late to go back. "My lady," Moena's voice interrupted her chaotic thoughts, "behold." There, within a ring of charcoal twigs, was a magnificent and astounding spectacle. Upon the top of the blessed hill rose a flourishing oak tree, the like of which she had never seen before. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yet how did it escape the flames?" "Rogar thought it prudent to leave well alone," Moena replied in a low whisper. "Even he dares not challenge the ancient powers." With that she strode over to the ferocious-looking enemy guard, leaving Ysabelle to wait in uncomfortable silence. Standing awkward and greatly ill at ease, she saw Moena greet the largest of the moonriders. Yet she could not catch what words passed between them. Ysabelle's face clouded over as doubt and foreboding filled her. She grew certain that this was an elaborate trap, and that the unfortunate Moena had been used by the bats to lure her into it. Her musings were soon dispelled, for Moena was already returning. "Most excellent news. I have persuaded them to let you pass inside the oak." Ysabelle shook her head. "Would you truly lead me further into the jaws of the enemy?" Moena turned pale. "Please, my lady, if you care for the lives of we who are left, you will follow me." "Very well," Ysabelle murmured. "Guide me to the oak." Taking the maiden by the paw, Moena walked quickly over the soot-covered ground to where the guards stood in rank upon rank of glittering armour. Each screech mask turned towards Ysabelle as she approached, and she was horrified to be so close to them. By the time she was taken to the great entrance, her nerves were overwrought. This was all wrong. "Summon thy sentries before I am taken and tortured by the waiting bats. Send them for Vesper Tilio." "Tortured?" uttered Moena in surprise. "No bats will harm thee here. My lady, did I not say that they dare not enter the hallowed oak?" "Is this not a trap of their devising?" "I think thy fancy has got the better of thee," Moena said. "But ought we not to repair at once to the chamber of the star-glass?" Isabelle relented, although a dreadful suspicion began to dawn. "Very well, take me there." Unlocking a small door, Moena passed inside a dry earthen tunnel, and with a last nervous look around her, Ysabelle went in after. The guttering candlelight sent their shadows dancing around the narrow way, and the squirrel maiden's unease mounted. From the legends she had heard about the star-glass, it was too large to have been carried down here. "Here our descent finishes," said Moena, coming to an abrupt standstill and flourishing the candle before a low doorway. From a belt around her waist she took a ring of keys and fitted one inside the lock. The mouldering door creaked open and she stepped inside. Ysabelle's scalp crawled. The chamber beyond was pitch dark and a damp, stale stink flowed from it. "I cannot go in there." "But you must." Ysabelle took a step backwards. "No sign of the star-glass can I see. Where have you brought me?" "To a most lovely corner of the realm," came the chilling response. "This is where the survivors of the Moonrider's assault were brought, and where you can at last greet thy new subjects." "You betrayed them, didn't you?" Ysabelle said. "You were the one." A light, careless laugh broke from Mowena's thin mouth. Such fancies. She took a step nearer, and Ysabelle stumbled out of reach. "What did Reffel promise you?" "Reffel? You think I laboured all those detestable and loathsome years simply for the benefit of that wizened bat? No, he and his wretched forces were simply my instruments." "Then why did you do this?" Mowena's eyes threw back the light of the candle and came stabbing through the darkness at Ysabelle. "I did it for my lord." "Hob?" Ysabelle murmured. "You are a worshipper of Hob?" "I am the priestess of Mab. When my lord emerges from the imperishable darkness, he shall release my true mistress from her long imprisonment, and I shall serve them both." Swiftly she snatched Ysabelle by the hair, and the maiden screamed in pain and terror, trying to prise away the claws, but Mowena's grip was tenacious and strong as her fingers closed round the silver acorn and she pulled it viciously from Ysabelle's neck. "No, you cannot take that!" Moena cackled. "The amulet is mine. There shall be no Starwife, but me." Fiercely she hauled Ysabelle into the dismal grotto, then gave her a rough push which sent her slithering over the muddy ground. "Come, my pretty ones," Moena crooned, holding the candle high above her head. "See what new morsel I bring." Scattered all around were hundreds of chewed and crunched-up bones, the grisly skeletal remains of some horrendous carnivorous feast. Moena held the silver acorn aloft and twirled it in the firelight. "I am certain your end will be a swift one, alas." "I am not afraid," Ysabelle called defiantly. Moena put her claw on the iron handle of the door. "Most commendable. But you really are no different to the others. When the time comes, I shall hear you sing, as they did." Hearing the key turn in the lock, Ysabelle came sliding through the mud and beat her fists upon the door. "Wait!" No sound came from the other side, and Ysabelle slumped against the sealed entrance in despair. On the surface of the dark water, A large bubble burst, and she stared across to see what had caused it. A pair of bulging golden eyes swept towards the shore, and as a repulsive, wart-covered head rose beneath them, they swivelled round to glare at her. She screamed for help, but Moena had gone, and there was no one to hear her. Beneath his covering of leaves, Vesper slowly unfurled one wing and gave a weary groan and then stared about the dark woods. "Ysabelle! Ysabelle! Where are you?" Countless possibilities as to what had happened flooded into his throbbing head. What if the gore-crow had carried her off to devour in seclusion? What if she had run away in terror and had fallen and injured herself? What if... He scowled and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Would it not be better to scout the land? From the air I might catch a glimpse of her. Flitting in a cautious circle to begin with, the bat tested the strength of his shoulder and was satisfied that it would bear him safely. Then he beat his wings more rapidly and shot up through the branches and into the heavens. "Hold there!" Vesper fluttered to a surprised halt. "Who is it?" From out of a knotted web of cindered branches, a knight of the moon came flying. "Declare thyself and thy errands here." "I am Vespertilio, son of Indus and Novatus." "Novatus?" The bat flew beside him and gave Vesper a hearty clap on the back. "Welcome, friend. Adwulf am I called. What calls those vicious cuts upon thy face? Hast thou encountered the enemy?" "I have not come to fight, but to find someone." The moon rider pulled away from him. "What riddles are these, child? Didst thou not know that a host of those foul tree-rats are marching towards us?" "The army of Ysabelle." "'Tis the enemy," Aldwulf snapped. "Behold, there fly the pouch-bombers with their fiery burdens. That pack of barbarous savages will soon know the meaning of terror." "You must listen to me," Vesper shouted. "You all must. This is not how it should be. The hoppers are the true menace." Aldwulf grabbed him by the throat and bared his fangs. "Avaunt! No craven weaning shall utter such filthy lies in my hearing." "Wait, I have spoken with the ancient. Please, you must listen." But the warrior soared away in disgust, his talons glittering a trail of silver light beneath him. Upon the ground, the mighty army that had set forth with Ysabelle from the Hazel realm drew their swords and raised their spears as the Holy Land loomed before them. "There must be something I can do," Vesper wailed. "I have to stop this." Thrashing the air desperately, he raced towards the huge cloud of moonriders who were already swarming after the pouch-bombers to assume attack formations. "Wait!" Vesper yelled. "This is wrong! Listen to me!" The immense host swooped over the hillside and circled round the lower slopes where the army of Col Regalis waited defiantly. Ysabelle's faithful border wardens strung arrows to their bows as the tremendous cloud of winged enemies blotted out the starlight. A resounding cheer was sent up, and a volley of arrows flew into the sky as a sign of defiance to the reviled flying vermin. With scornful laughter, the first phalanx of pouch-bombers dived down. "The flame of victory is with us!" The young bat trembled as far below the slaughter commenced. Squirrels burned in the dreaded flames, and moonriders plummeted to the earth, pierced by many arrows. As the fire eggs continued to blast and shake the ground, Rogar's voice bawled the order, and his legions plunged downward, their razor-sharp talons outstretched. "Forgive me," Vesper whispered. "I did all I could, yet it was in vain." He could stand it no longer. Torn with remorse and filled with the dread of what was to come, the bat turned from the carnage that raged below and flew away. "Oh, Ysabelle, where are you?" The Lady Moena hurried up the steep stairway, clutching the silver acorn tightly to her bosom. Up she sped, pausing only to hear the sounds of battle echoing from outside the hallowed oak. Soon those meagre forces would be overthrown by Hobb's followers, and true darkness would be reborn. At last all my struggles and hardships are ended. The old life shall wither, and the new will begin. In her fist the silver acorn tingled and pulled her towards the centre of the chamber. The closer the amulet came to the star-glass, the more agitated it became, and Moena strove to control the violet tugs which wrenched her forward. Beneath the embroidered cloak the star-glass rippled, and the black material billowed as power surged from its immeasurable depths. A triumphant laugh issued from Moena's lips, and she took hold of the cloak to drag it from the magical device. Then she froze. Wait! If I uncover the glass, then the walls of defence shall spring back round the hill, and the worshippers of Hob will be unable to invade. Her claws twitched away from the cloak, and she staggered back to the doorway. The silver acorn grew dull once more behind the immovable bloodstains as Moena fled down the sacred stair. In the deserted chamber, the star-glass became still, and the cloak continued to suffocate its magic. Ysabelle shrank against the damp and dripping wall. Two bloated and glistening toads stalked her, and behind them she could see another emerging from the scummy water. A long tongue lashed from the nearest slime-oozing beast and flicked across Ysabelle's arm. She cried out in revulsion and terror as another tongue came snaking for her, this time slithering around her tail. "No!" she protested, slipping on the mud as the whips of muscle dragged her forward. But there was nothing she could do, and when a third tongue twisted about her, this time squeezing round her neck, all Ysabelle's cries were strangled into a choking silence. Suddenly, the mouldering timbers of the door splintered, bursting asunder as a raging fury came crashing into the dismal grotto. "Be gone!" commanded a voice that boomed throughout the cavern. "Release her!" The toads cringed and flinched as the hateful intruder charged, lashing out at them like a thing demented. They shuffled away from Ysabelle and then slithered down the bank to the safety of the water. Ysabelle gasped, "Vespertilio, I never thought to see you again." "Nor I you, but be quick, little time is left to us." Up through the narrow tunnels Ysabelle ran until she reached the entrance to the hallowed oak and passed within, swiftly climbing the stairs beyond. Vesper flitted behind her, flying over the winding stairs, and came gliding into the hall, alighting at her side. In stricken silence they stared out at the withered hilltop and watched fierce red flames blast upwards, and the clashing of steel against steel rang in the infernal night. Unfurling one wing, Vesper spread it about them both, as if to shield them from the horror to come. As he did so, his thumb brushed the strap fastened over his shoulder, and he tugged at it irritably. The leather bag at his waist gave a jerk, and Vesper stared down, amazed at his own stupidity. "Ysabelle, come, before it is too late." Dragging her from the vast tree and out into the troubled night, the bat bounded over the hill to where a small, neglected campfire brightly crackled. Stepping up to the flames, he held the gift of the ancient aloft, and glancing desperately at Ysabelle, poured the powdered contents into the fire's heart. On the slopes of Greenreach a bitter war rampaged, bloody and savage. The squirrels of Col Regalis had lost many of their host to the scalding flames of the pouch bombers, and countless archers had fallen before the steel gauntlets of Hethrel's forces. "In the name of the hazel," Warden Mugwort roared, cleaving a wounded bat in two. Leaping over the fallen corpses of both races, he swung the blood-soaked sword over his head to await another assault. Yet none came. Amid the inferno of burning trees, the squirrels stared in bewilderment into the smoky heavens. Flying with great urgency from the field of combat, every Knight of the Moon was returning to the hilltop of Greenreach, as though summoned by a single command which none could ignore. With the light of the beacon bleaching all colour from his furry face, Vesper felt the urge to fly upwards and spiral about the flame. But he gritted his teeth, and with Ysabelle at his side, mastered the insistent summons and stared into the sky. Ysabelle looked steadily into his eyes. "I have faith in you. This is your hour. Seize the chance and put a final end to the evil war." Her confidence inspired him, and he gazed upwards where the first of the moonriders were congregating about the intense light, fluttering around it like giant moths. Up he flew, and as he soared beside the blinding tower of flame, his mind reeled trying to think what to say. How could he ever reconcile his race with Ysabelle's? Just then one of the moonriders chanced to look at the ground, and there he spied Isabelle standing alone and defenceless. "General Rogar, behold, is that not the heathen savage our agent withheld from us and guided inside the oak?" The great bat peered down and laughed within his screech mask. "Verily, it is the same. Now she is ours. Let us shred her vile being into 1,000 ribbons." Vesper was horrified. Screaming with fear and rage, the youngster swept his wings behind him and hurtled towards the ground. Hastily, he leaped in front of Ysabelle and spread his wings wide. If they were going to kill Ysabelle, it would have to be through him. "What deception is this?" Rogar screamed. "Why dost thou defend that rat of the trees?" "The squirrels are not our enemies," Vesper shouted defiantly. "We have all been betrayed." "If thou dost wish to be skewered along with that filth, then so be it," Rogar snarled, raising his talons to Vesper's throat. Suddenly a horn sounded, and all eyes turned to the rim of the hill. Brandishing their weapons in challenge, the army of Ysabelle surged forward, and for a moment all was confusion. Using all his strength, Vesper shoved Rogar aside and pulled the squirrel after him. Out before the ranks of the moonriders they ran, dashing headlong into the vanguard of the squirrel troops. Then, before Ysabelle could resist, he had pulled her close and pressed his lips against hers. Squirrels and bats stumbled over each other as they beheld the unbelievable sight, and a ghastly, appalled hush descended. All waited on the young bat's explanation for this unnatural union. Gravely his audience listened as Vesper related the horrors which had pursued him and the squirrel maiden through the forest. The royal guards of Ysabelle stared at their queen in wonder as the fearful account of the past days unfolded. The Knights of the Moon, who hearkened to Vesper, removed their screech masks and gazed guiltily across at the strength of the hazel realm. Their bead-like eyes gleamed fiercely as the story rolled on, until they learned the name of the one who had truly stolen their birthright. "Rether," repeated Rogar, enraged at the young bat's insolence. "How dare you accuse our great lord?" The moonriders eyed him uncomfortably. "Yet it would explain much," said one. "Why does he no longer attend the councils? And why does he suffer no one to enter his chamber?" "His actions are not for us to question," Rogar snapped. From his warriors the general received some approval, but the majority of the bats shouted them down. At the forefront of the hazel forces, Warden Mugwort loosened his grip on his sword and sought for the strength to forgive. From the rear of the squirrel army, a high, frantic voice piped up. "I must get by. Oh, my lady, oh, my poor heart, it flutters so." Ysabelle turned and gazed into the centre of her troops. A delighted smile lit her face, and she gave a grateful laugh. "Griselda!" From the ranks of the squirrels the small mouse came. "Oh, my lady, I knew you were safe. I knew it, I did." Vesper grinned as they greeted one another, but there was still much to be done. "The children of the Wraithshe must be our first concern," he declared. From high above them a cold voice rang out. "Vain, empty words." There, in the topmost branches of the hallowed oak, stood Moena. The royal guards gazed at her in disbelief. for around her neck the silver acorn gleamed dully. Rogar bared his fangs and seized his screech mask once more. "Gladly shall I slay that foul deceiver," he exclaimed, donning Slaughtermore and rising into the air. Suddenly from the dark night many black shapes darted. Surging from the shadows, they fell upon the great general and surrounded him in a frenzy of feathers and hellish squawks. With an agonized wail, Slaughtermore was wrenched from his head, and in a moment the bat's lifeless body tumbled down after it. High above them, Moena laughed to herself. The foes of Hob had not seen the full might of her followers yet. She raised her claw to give the signal, and at once the terror of her enemies doubled. All about the hilltop a sea of fiery faces reared, flames dripping from their gaping mouths. A horrendous mass of evil creatures flourished their hob-lanterns and came charging forward, screaming foul oaths and curses. As a horrific battle started to rage about her, Ysabelle stared at the uppermost branches of the hallowed oak. There Moena haughtily shrieked her commands, instructing the children of the Wraith-She and guiding them towards the inevitable victory. A wintry calm entered Ysabelle's soul, as her hatred for that artful traitor swelled, and she knew what must be done. Swiftly she ran to the great entrance and raced up the staircase which spiraled inside the gigantic trunk of the mighty tree. At the Starwife's bedchamber the maiden hesitated. The shutters of the window had been thrown wide open, and in an instant she had crossed the room. Ysabelle lifted her eyes to where a branch twisted gracefully from the tapering trunk, and upon which a tall, cloaked figure stood. Hurriedly the maiden clambered out, and clinging to the bark, climbed up to the bough. "The amulet," she demanded. "Give it to me." Moena wrinkled her snout in disdain. "Now the time has come for me to join the silver with the glass." "I shall not let you take up the Starwife ship," Isabelle cried. With her cloak billowing in the high breeze, Moena raised her claws and stepped nearer to the squirrel maiden. Suddenly a pouch-bomber came shooting beneath the branch, pursued by a screeching gore-crow. The bat swerved, veering around the enormous trunk, but the bird tore unerringly down, and before the Moonrider could check himself, they collided and smashed into the side of the tree. A tremendous explosion ripped through the bark as the fire eggs the bat carried burst into devouring flame. Ysabelle was thrown off balance and almost fell to her doom. But as the fierce ball of flame scorched the leaves behind her and leapt into the midnight sky, Moena, the priestess of Mab, came steadily closer. "The end of all that you find good is here," she said softly. The maiden backed away. Then Moena gasped, and her claws flew to the amulet about her neck. "It burns. The silver burns." From deep beneath the earth the vile roar came bellowing, and in the sky the carrion birds squawked in fear. "My lord is coming," exulted Moena, the acorn gleaming around her neck. "His dark majesty approaches." From the steaming earth, to the terror of all, the god of the rats, the lord of the Wraith-She, slowly emerged. 2 massive horns punctured the tormented ground as the master of the pit reared into the waking world. The horns that twisted from the forehead of the titanic apparition curved high into the night, and even from where he stood, Vesper could see they were steeped in blood. Out from the pit the lord of the Wraith-She climbed, his cloven hoofs stamping on the earth, and with his head thrown back he beat his claws upon his chest. Free at last. In the upper branches Ysabelle turned her face from the awful vision and gripped the bark desperately as the tree shook and trembled. Moena was jubilant, gazing down as the 2 horns came rearing up. She threw her arms open in greeting. "Welcome, my lord." A hideously gnarled claw reached up, and Ysabelle screamed. Wendell's curse had come true. Hob was going to claim her. "Send her to the pit," Moena squealed. But something was wrong. Hob was not reaching for the maiden, but for her. "No, I am the one who released you." Terrified, she realized her mistake and tried to tear the symbol of the Starwife from her neck. It was the power of the acorn which had summoned her diabolic master, and by invoking his dreaded name, his own high priest had cursed the bearer of the amulet. The priestess screamed when the talons squeezed. "You are mistaken, Lord. Spare me." With imploring squeals still on her lips, Moena was plucked from the branch and dragged into the swirling heat. The shrieks of the treacherous squirrel died as her body crackled and burnt, writhing in the ghastly furnace. Now Hob turned his attention to Ysabelle. Suddenly a draught ruffled her fur, and Vesper's voice came shouting from above, "Hold on to me!" And before Hob could snatch at her, the squirrel had gone. But now the night was filled with angry voices as the Knights of the Moon showed their mettle and zoomed towards the rat god's monstrous head, mustering their forces above him. The unholy Lord of the Wraith-She roared in fury, bringing his fist smashing down against the trunk of the hallowed oak. With a thunderous creaking of timber, the tree toppled and went crashing through the air. Ysabelle spoke quickly into Vesper's ear. "Take me down to the very feet of that abomination." As soon as her feet touched the earth, Ysabelle raced over to the cloven hooves and snatched the discarded amulet to her bosom. "Hurry," she cried, wrapping her arms about Vesper's neck. "To the fallen oak." Over the devastation, Vesper flew, and Ysabelle scanned the dismal sight keenly. "There! Take me down there." Through the shattered tangle of torn twigs and branches, Ysabelle hurried, striving to reach what she had seen lying upon the grass. There it was, the dark circle of the star-glass, thrown clear from the fractured tree. The black glass rippled and churned, and within the amulet an answering light welled up. "Now is the time," Ysabelle cried. "Now do I accede to the throne and claim my place as handmaiden to Orion." The high-pitched sonorous note ran in Ysabelle's ears, and a wintry chill passed into her fingers, searing up her arm until she spluttered, and a halo of silvery light shone round her. Then abruptly all was dark. Vesper rubbed his eyes, but it was a few moments before they adjusted and he was able to see again. The star-glass was calm and still once more, and standing beside it, Ysabelle turned a resolute and solemn face to the young bat. "What happened?" Vesper muttered. "I accepted the high office, and the power is now channeled through me." "But what does that mean?" "The Starwife ship is truly mine. Take me back." Vesper began thrashing his wings, and the Starwife held on to him as they climbed into the sky. "Lord of the Wraith-She," called Ysabelle, letting go of Vesper and dropping to the ground as he swooped down. "Hearken to me. The world has no use for thee. The time of darkness is gone. Never shalt thou trouble the world again." For the first time in many ages, the demonic god of the rats now spoke. "There is no fetter in all creation strong enough to bind me. I am free, and thy haughty words can inflict no harm." "I cannot permit thee to stalk the troubled earth," Ysabelle cried. "Begone from here, beast of the poisoned seas." The amulet in the Starwife's paws crackled with magical force, and the stars blazed in the firmament as the power waxed steadily. Sprawling, the Lord Hob raised a cloven hoof to crush the squirrel beneath him. Yet even as he brought it smashing down, a streak of lightning struck one of his horns, which burst into white flame. Never had the Lord of the Wraith-she known such pain, and he screeched in convulsing torment, "Witch, what hast thou done?" All around the hilltop his followers and the squirrels gaped in terror as he bayed and shrieked. The flame-enveloped figure was slowly diminishing, dwindling behind the sizzling sparks and shrinking into the ground. Then all was dark, and the raging wind sighed into a calm and peaceful silence. The hideous majesty of the Lord Hob had utterly vanished. "You destroyed him," Vesper marvelled. The Starwife shook her head feebly. "He cannot be destroyed. The god of the rats lies yonder." Nervously, Vesper flitted to where she pointed and found a simple acorn. With infinite caution, Vesper picked it up and brought it reverently back to Ysabelle. "There is the prison I wrought. An acorn called him, and by that he was doomed. Hob is not merely trapped within the shell. His very being is locked within the nature of this, and as long as it lasts, and the squirrel sits upon the Oaken Throne, so shall the term of his imprisonment." "Then you must keep it safe." "No, Vespertilia. The acorn must be buried. A tree must grow, and that oak shall flourish for over 1,000 years." And with that, Ysabelle slumped to the floor, exhausted by the forces she had unleashed. But the danger was not yet over. With a sudden wail, the members of the Hob cult leaped upon the squirrel army. The squirrels yelled in dismay. Roars of victory erupted from their broiling foe as they surged forward in one violent charge. The forces of the Hazel realm were swept aside, and the battle seemed to be nearing a grim conclusion. Suddenly a loud trumpet blast boomed over the hilltop, and from the forest an immense host was marching up the hill. Never had such a force been assembled, for here were 2 of the remaining squirrel houses, and their mighty armies contained 10,000 courageous souls, all geared for war and eager for battle. Yet what made Vesper's heart leap inside him was the sight of those who came at the vanguard of the vast number. With swords drawn, the surviving woodlanders from the ruined mounds stormed up the hillside, and Fenny was at their head. The ensuing battle was brief and deadly. Nearly all the worshippers of the Wraith-she were destroyed, but some managed to flee with their lives and ran shrieking into the forest to lick their wounds and wait for another day. With jubilant cheers mingled with wails of lamentation filling his ears, Fen Poorfoot strode through the bodies of rat and squirrel over to the huge roots of the hallowed oak where Vesper and Ysabelle lay. "Hail, Captain," Vesper whispered. "Glad am I to see you again." The mouse smiled, then looked at the maiden at his side. "Thy friend is pale. The denizens of the Ivy House are skilled healers. Let me call them." "No, the Starwife is fatigued. No more." An anxious voice suddenly trilled behind him.
"My lady, don't fret none. I'll soon be with thee."
As Griselda hurried from the midst of her mistress's army, Vesper made a desperate appeal to the mouse captain. "Please keep that nursemaid from us for a while longer." Fenny nodded and turned to lead the clucking mouse away from the tangled roots. Alone with Ysabelle, Vesper drew her close and kissed her lightly on the forehead, and as her eyes fluttered open, the first rays of the morning sun edged into the sky. The celebrations lasted for many days, yet it was a time in which Ysabelle saw little of Vesper, for his people had one last score to settle, and had besieged the chamber of the evil Lord Arethel. 2 whole weeks stretched by, and the warden of the great book refused to come forth. Then one evening, a messenger came from Greenreach announcing that the new Starwife was to be inaugurated by her subjects. Eagerly, Vesper took the tidings to the new general, who somberly granted him permission to attend. Preparations for the approaching ceremony were nearing completion as Vesper sat down. "Vespertilio," called the voice. The bat jumped, and his toothy grin lit his face as Ysabelle came regally through the grass towards him. "I longed for thee to be here this day. Nothing could keep me from your side." The maiden laughed as they embraced. "Oh, there is so much to tell," she said. "Ysabelle," the bat interrupted, "I have something to say to you." The squirrel blinked at him in surprise. "What is the matter?" "Hear me now. We must flee this place. Do not take part in the ceremony. Relinquish thy high office. Come with me. Let us begin a new life far from here. Our devotion can overcome all obstacles. I know it can." Isabelle glanced back at the tents and all the banners which flew above them. "But I am the Starwife." "Let them find another." "I cannot." "Isabelle, you love me. I know you do. How can you deny the happiness which would be ours?" "Enough, Vespertilio. You do not know the grave responsibilities which now burden me. I am the Starwife, and my duty comes above all things. The dream is ended now. Goodbye." With tears streaking down her face, she spun on her heel and raced over the hilltop to where Griselda was waiting for her. Surrounded by the swaying flowers which rustled in the breeze, Vesper wept, desolate and filled with despair. "What is this?" came a velvet voice. "Sadness on such a glad day of rejoicing?" Through the salty blur of his tears, Vesper saw a cloaked figure rising from the grasses. A deep hood obscured the stranger's face. "I'm afraid that I was sleeping when thy voices awoke me." "What? What did you hear?" "Enough to know how forlorn thou art. Wilt thou not drink a toast with a passing wayfarer? If not to the future, which you see so bleak, then to the past." From a pocket in his cloak he took a small bottle that flashed and winked in the bright sunshine as he pushed it into Vesper's grasp. Politely he received it and put the phial to his lips. Abruptly the figure let out a mocking laugh. "Did I not say my curse would hound thee?" hissed the scornful shade of Wendell Maculatum. "Taste now the full bitterness of thy doom." Vesper gasped in horror as the empty cloak sank amid the flowers and the malevolent spirit fled back to its cold tomb. Only then, as he stared helplessly around him, did the young bat understand, and the curse was finally fulfilled. Prattling constantly, Griselda led her mistress down to the chamber the woodlanders had prepared. But Ysabelle was not listening. She was thinking only of Vesper. Now the prince of the Ivy House came to the dais. In his paws he bore the silver amulet which had been entrusted to him for this most magnificent occasion. "No," Isabelle cried, "I will not accept it." "But, most noble monarch, the acceptance is made. This is a mere formality." "I do not care." The court was scandalized and uttered shrieks of protest. Only one figure refrained from voicing his displeasure, and a great glad smile split his face from ear to ear. "That's right," Fenny called. Ysabelle stared at the mouse captain and laughed. "I must go to him." "Green be with thee both," the mouse called as Ysabelle hurtled up the stairs. Past the brightly coloured tents she hurried, her true love's name always on her lips. "Vesper," she sang, "Vesper, forgive me. Up to the place where she had left him, Ysabelle fled, and her heart nearly burst with the emotion that swelled inside her. Then the squirrel maiden judded to a halt and stared aghast at the terrible sight which met her eyes. "No," she whimpered. "Oh, please, no." There, with the tiny phial of blue glass still in his grasp, and the traces of its contents glistening upon his lips, her one and only love lay dead. "Vesper? Oh, Vesper, forgive me." But the only answer came from the delicate bluebells, which rustled and swayed around them.